what I just did. This is what happens when you give a history major free reign to do whatever they want. Okay. Can I go ahead and do the intro? Because it's going to be long.
Yes. Go.
Okay.
Get it done.
Okay. Hi, everybody. You were listening to The Triad, where we're spooky but sensitive. I'm Shannon.
I'm Shelby.
I'm Hannah.
Yay. Okay. Do we have any quick announcements?
I drove to the airport today and cut off 3 people, and they got really mad, and I don't care.
There's a tornado outside my window.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yep.
That's why we're trying to hurry. Plus, I have 24 pages of notes. So.
Oh my god, yes. That text chain, I really wanted to strangle you, but I restrained myself.
Shannon also has 49 slides.
I consolidated. There were 50. I consolidated too.
Oh, good. Oh, perfect.
Right? She made it better.
I made it better.
Just for us.
I have a lot to say about the Titanic, okay?
Well, spoiler alert, we're talking about the Titanic today.
It's in the title! Like... Okay, I have an outline and a PowerPoint in the episodes folder.
I am there.
Yes, I see you in there. So... Okay, yes. There's 49 slides and I have 24 pages of notes, so just buckle in. There's a lot of information. So,
Shut the hell your mouths. Here we go.
What?
I said, shut the hell your mouths. Here we go.
So, today we're talking about the Titanic. We're going to be talking about the White Star Line, the construction and the voyage of the Titanic. We're going to talk about the sinking, but nothing, like, harrowing about it. And then we're going to talk about, like, why it sank and why there was such a huge loss of life. And then we're going to talk about stuff that happened after the Titanic sank. So,
disclaimer, Shelby and I both have, like, ocean phobias.
In case we haven't, in case we haven't discussed it 15 times. They don't like the ocean.
But, like, I sent you that TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
That is a manifestation of my fear.
Yeah,
I'm not even
that
tell
thing
you
was
what it was, Shelby, because I
terrifying.
think you would shit your pants.
Oh, awesome.
was an
I was like,
ocean
I didn't get
creature.
a TikTok.
You didn't
I
want
send
it.
To you.
You didn't
I didn't
want
want
it.
you to have to experience that.
Yeah,
Yep.
you didn't want it. Yeah. And because the Titanic is one of my, like, areas of interest, I suppose, I kind of went a little, I probably did a little bit too much, but that's okay. So.
Crackers?
Yeah, a little bit. Well, I'm trying to avoid saying I went overboard.
Make the pun, please. God.
So yeah, anyway, this is going to be very thorough and a lot of information. If at any point you two feel uncomfortable with what I am leading us into or with something I'm saying, tell me and I'll just skip ahead. I don't think we're going to get to that point, but just in case.
Shannon's very thoughtful in that she texts us and she's like, this is what I'm going to talk about. Will it freak you guys out? And
yeah.
So we're pretty sure we'll be okay.
Yeah. I don't want anyone to go into a panic attack. So,
I'll just turn my computer off and pretend that the power went out.
That's fine.
Yep.
We'll do that too.
Look, just don't ever do an episode on the Marianas Trench, and I
wasn't
fine.
planning on it. I wasn't planning on it. This is the only other sea-related thing I was going to do for a while, at least. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
As long as we're on top of the ocean, I can kind of
all
be
good.
okay.
On top of the
Yeah.
ocean. That's why I
Okay.
think boats should have legs. I will reiterate this statement. I think boats should have legs. If you can touch the bottom, then it's not a problem.
Excuse me, I'm drinking a ski. This is
They'd
not...
have to be
should not have done
extendable
that.
and retractable legs.
Yeah.
You should probably tell people what a ski is. Cause
Oh,
nobody knows
ski
what that
is like a local version of Mountain Dew, basically.
Yeah, it's like
We have that up here, but it's called Moxie, and I think it's more like root beer, and I don't know, it just looks like poison to me, so...
Well, I didn't even know we had any here. I've been here for I'm at my mom's house, by the way. I've been here for 2 weeks. No one told me we had ski in the fridge downstairs, and then I was looking for a drink in there just now, and I was like, what the hell? We have a whole thing of ski. Whatever. Anyway, my sources. So, I have 4 different Wikipedia articles. And I got most of my information from there. And this is why. So normally when I research things, I start at Wikipedia and then I go and read the sources that are linked, and I try to get most of my information from the sources directly. The problem is a lot of these sources are from books that I do not have access to. So instead, we're just quoting straight from Wikipedia, because there's a Titanic Wikipedia article and a lifeboats of the Titanic and a sinking of the Titanic and a White Star Line article. So
cool.
I pulled from those a lot. I also have an article from the engineering department at Penn State. I have an article from SimScale, which I think is an engineering firm. I didn't look that deeply into it. They have something to do with engineering. I have an article from ABC News. I have an article from National Geographic, and I have an article from CNN. So that's all my sources. So first off, we are going to talk about the White Star Line. So if you can go to the next slide. The White Star Line was the company that owned the Titanic, basically. So it was a British shipping company founded in 1845 in Liverpool, England. They originally shipped cargo and immigrants from England to Australia. Due to...
I hate that those were together.
I know, but that was how they saw it for sure.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And then, so yeah, due to a bad merger and some other financial decisions, it actually went bankrupt in 1868. It was purchased by a man named Thomas Ismay, which that is that man on the right there. At that point, he struck a deal with a shipbuilding company named Harland and Wolff and began their first transatlantic services. And just to be absolutely clear, transatlantic means you're going from basically the UK to the United States in this context. And so they provided passenger and cargo services between the British Empire and the US. Other lines, so like other shipping lines, other sailing companies, I suppose, they focused more on speed, but the White Star Line focused on comfort for its passengers, which is why the Titanic was like so extravagant. That was normal for them up to a point, you know what I mean? Yeah. So their first Atlantic run was with their Oceanic class of ships, which was comprised of 6 nearly identical ships. And then in the 1870s, one of those ships, the Republic, was moved to a route to South America. So they're expanding even further in the 1870s. So their first substantial loss of a ship was the RMS or SS Atlantic. So if you can go to the next slide, that's a drawing of the Atlantic. I'm going to take a tiny detour to talk about British ship prefixes. So RMS and SS are the same thing. So RMS means Royal Mail Ship or Steamer. SS means Steamship or Steamer. So they had the same duties, the same obligations, the same rights, etc. So basically, if you're an RMS, that means that you have a contract with the British government to carry mail. And so while some lines called all of their ships RMS, technically a ship would use that prefix only while they're carrying mail. And then when they're not, they would revert back to SS. And then HMS is his/Her Majesty's ship. HMHS is his/Her Majesty's hospital ship. And I'm bringing these up because I'm going to mention a whole lot more ships, and they all have these designations, and I just wanted to explain what they are because I know it gets kind of confusing. And so basically these designations mean that the ship has some kind of contract with the British royal government, and that, you know, depending on what the letters are, that would tell a layperson, oh, that one carries mail. That one's a hospital ship. Stuff like that. So the Atlantic, it's on March 31st, 1873, near Halifax, Nova Scotia. It sank, and 535 lives were lost. It took roughly the same route as the Titanic. It was going from Liverpool to New York instead of Southampton to New York, but it was roughly the same. And so they were en route to New York from Liverpool. There was a really bad storm. The Atlantic attempted to make port at Halifax when they became concerned that they were going to run out of coal before reaching New York. And then when they attempted to enter Halifax to get more coal, the ship ran aground on the rocks and sank in shallow water. Despite being so close to shore, a majority of those on board drowned, with 585 of the 952 on board perishing. And then White Star the White Star Line found itself being accused of not having supplied enough coal to the ship, while the captain was sanctioned for having acted in an irresponsible manner. And then the crew were blamed for serious navigational errors by the Canadian Inquiry, although a British Board of Trade investigation cleared the company of all wrongdoing. All extreme wrongdoing, excuse me. We need that qualifier in there. And then, are you guys still there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just making sure.
Wrong, but it was not extreme. I'm trying to be quiet.
No, you're fine.
We're being good, Shannon. Damn it.
I need some, like, assurance that you're there. Otherwise, I'm really worried that you guys aren't there. And so after this incident, Ismay himself personally contributed to maintenance of graves for the victims, and the company financed a monument to the victims. So I just wanted to highlight this because it was their first substantial loss as a company, and just to show that, like, they lost a lot of ships. Like, I don't know if it's, like the amount that they lost, I don't know if it was normal compared to other lines. Like, I couldn't really figure that out, but to me, it seemed like they lost a lot of ships. But they were also in business for a really long time, so, like, I don't know.
It's one of those things where, like, any sort of business on the ocean is dangerous regardless.
Yeah.
But just because there's so many, like, unknown variables with the ocean, and honestly, you can really only do so much to control a ship.
Yeah. Which that will become
especially a ship of that size.
Yeah.
Because, like, you can only, like, make it turn so quickly and, like, things like that. So I understand.
And Mark's mowing the lawn. Fantastic. All right.
I can't hear it, but
I can.
Okay. Well, it depends on if
It's
Audacity
fine.
picks it up.
Coming through my window any second.
Yeah.
I bet part of my roof is gonna blow off, and I'm not, like, being dramatic or exaggerating.
No, I know.
It's already happened. The flashing on the side of my house is not stable in any way, and I do expect it to fly off.
Oh, man. All right.
Awesome. So this is already going swimmingly.
It's great. It's fine.
Oh,
okay.
thunder.
So just
Sorry. Also, Shelby, that was a terrible
swimmingly. One. Yeah.
Did I do it on purpose? Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so to get back, we're only on page 2. So in 1897, Ismay and other officials decided that they needed more ships in the North Atlantic fleet because they had specific ships that went on specific routes. They didn't just get moved around constantly. So by this point in time, the only remaining ship of the original Oceanic class was Adriatic, which had been in service for 25 years and was starting to show her age. I don't know what happened to the other ships. I know at least one of them sank. I think another one may have also sank, and then the others may have just been removed from service or moved to a different line. I'm not really sure. But this idea eventually led to the construction of the Titanic. So in 1902, the White Star Line was bought by the International Mercantile Marine Company, which was owned by J.P. Morgan, and they began constructing the Olympic class of ships shortly afterward. And so this was the RMS Olympic, the RMS Titanic, and the HMHS Britannic. So,
LOL.
So, moving on to the construction of the Titanic, if you can go to the next slide.
Also, if you don't know why I LOL'd, please refer back to episode I don't know what number about Violet Jessup. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, we talk about her a tiny bit later when we talk about all the lifeboats and everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, this picture is just them constructing the Titanic. So construction began on March 31st, 1909, and the goal here was to build the largest ship ever built. It took a year just to frame it out, after which large steel plates were riveted to the frame, and the shell plating on the hull was completed in October of 1910, which was about a year and a half after construction began. And then they began work on the interior in May of 1911. So there were some issues during construction. So, I mean, first off, just practically, it took them a while to get the necessary equipment to build the ship because no other ship of this size had been attempted. Like, they had to special order these gigantic cranes, and I mean, you see all that scaffolding. Like, it just took them forever to even get the stuff that they needed to build it.
Yep.
And then on top of that, there were about 15,000 men who worked on building the ship. Safety precautions were basically non-existent because it was 1909. Excuse me. During construction, there were 246 injuries recorded, with 28 of those being labeled severe. I think that meant they lost a limb. And then Yeah, and then 6 people died on the ship while she was being constructed. 2 more died in the shipyard, and 1 died just before launch. I almost said lunch. Just before launch after a piece of wood fell on him. So
Just before
he
lunch.
got unlucky. Yeah.
It was right before lunch. I lost old Jim.
So then the dimensions of the ship, so if you can go to the next slide, this is the Titanic against a modern day cruise liner, which I just think is interesting just to see how far we've come in the past 100 or so years.
Ugh.
Yeah, so the Titanic was...
Did you hear that thunder?
No, but I'm sure your microphone did.
Ah! I am going to die.
It's okay. You'll be okay, I promise.
Really quick aside.
yes.
I know you said
You're
not
fine.
to, but
No, it's
this is
fine. We
very
need
relevant.
tangents to break it all up. This is going to be a really morbid episode otherwise.
Okay, Mike just got a new job, and he is now a woodworker for, like, super fancy-ass yachts.
Oh.
He, like, makes the interiors of them. Yeah, I know.
Cool.
And there's a 6-year waiting list if you want to jump on that and, you know, get your yacht in, your yacht order in.
You know, in 6 years, maybe I'll have enough money to afford a canoe.
Yeah. Maybe a raft. I'm leaning more toward a raft for me personally.
Like an inflatable
Yeah.
raft.
Oh, dude,
Yeah.
you can go down to Walmart
That you
and get
blow
one
up
of those
yourself.
shitty kayaks, you know?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're pretty cheap. They last
have a
about
lot-
half
Yeah.
a season.
Yeah. Yeah, that's about where I'll be in 6 years probably.
You can just
so.
tip over every 3 seconds. It's fine.
It's fine.
It be what it be.
I'll just get a paddleboard.
I'm afraid to use those. I feel like I'm going to fall. Jesus, I heard
holy
that.
shit.
Was that right on top of you?
I felt like I had my hand on the mouse and I took it off when I saw it because I didn't want to get electrocuted.
Oh my
Can I
gosh.
get electrocuted through my headphones? Am I gonna die?
No, you're okay.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding, but like also not
Yeah.
really kidding.
Okay, so back to the Titanic. So the dimensions of the Titanic. She was 882 feet and 9 inches long. Her total height measured from the base of the keel, which is like the very bottom of the underside of the ship, to the top of the bridge, which is where the captain is, was 104 feet. That's not including the funnels. So it's just like the physical like ship was 104 feet tall, and then you also had those funnels up on top. And then her internal volume was 46,328 gross register tons. I don't know what that means, but that made her the biggest ship at the time. That's all I know. And that's all you guys need to know. She's huge. That's all we need to know. So, some design features of the ship. There were 10 decks, 8 of which were for passenger use. It had these very glamorous and extravagant features, such as the grand staircase. So if you can go to the next slide, these are just some photos from the Titanic. So the one on the right is the staircase that's super famous and well known. The one on the left is some kind of a lounge, which I'm assuming is for first class passengers.
It looks fancy.
Yeah, and so there were those 4 funnels that released smoke from the coal-fired engines. Only 3 of them actually worked. The aftmost, which is the one in the very back of the ship, was used for kitchen ventilation, and to just aesthetically, it looked better with 4. So, so that was why there were 4. It had a Maisie. Sorry, Maisie's crying. God, this so much background noise already, and we're only like 20 minutes in. So the ship had a radio telegraph room. So if you can go to the next slide, this is a picture of that room. This is it's a telegram operator, basically. It was just called radio telegraph at the time. So this allowed the operators of the telegraph to send passenger telegrams and handle navigational messages, such as weather reports and ice warnings that they got from other ships.
That they didn't get in time.
We'll get there. We'll get there. This is one of the things I added last night. I just wanted to throw in that the crew cabins were called glory holes. It was derived because that used to be the name. Well, because back in the day, glory hole referred to a cupboard where useful but miscellaneous items are stored. And apparently the crew quarters were like cupboards, so they called them glory holes.
I love it.
Everything about that is wrong.
I know. I just
Everything
wanted to
about
throw
that
that
is
in
terrible.
there. So, in order to sail on the Titanic and on like any other ship at the time, passenger could buy tickets for first, second, or third class accommodations. So everything I'm about to quote, actually for the entire rest of this thing, if I'm quoting something, it's from Wikipedia unless I explicitly tell you otherwise. So, let's see. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So slide 8. Among the more novel features available to first-class passengers was a 7-foot deep saltwater swimming pool, a gymnasium, a squash court, a Turkish bath, which comprised of an electric bath, a steam room, a cool room, a massage room, and a hot room. I don't know what the difference is. So the one on the left is the picture of a first-class like bedroom, and then the one on the right is one of their dining rooms. There were a shit ton of like well-known rich people in first class, so we're going to talk about some of them later. But it was definitely like, I think the Wikipedia page described it as like a who's who of society at the time, which I also found out who's who is from an actual like list that used to be published in newspapers of like who the famous people are right now. So that's...
I'm not surprised.
No. So, yeah, so first class accommodations were, like these first class accommodations were the most luxurious on any passenger ship at the time. And so for second class passengers, these were tourists, academics, and like middle class families. So if you can go to the next slide, that picture on the left is one of their bedrooms. The one on the right is one of their dining room. I think it may have been their only dining room. I'm not really sure. And so the ship's musicians who did go down with the ship were given second class accommodations instead of bunking with the crew because they technically were under a contract with White Star Line and not members of the crew. I just thought that was interesting. So second class passengers had their own library, private smoking room, and a promenade. Oh my goodness, I should not be drinking this ski. And so the second class...
Who's burping now,
I know. And so the second class accommodations were similar to first class accommodations on smaller ships. Just to give you a scale of like how off the charts insane the first class accommodations were. And so while the third class accommodations were obviously nowhere near as luxurious as first or even second class, they were the best being offered by pretty much any line at the time. So if you can go
you don't have to sleep on the floor.
No, they don't. They get beds. So if you can go to slide 10, the left is a bunk room. The one on the right is their dining room. So basically, I don't want to say all of the people in third class were immigrants, but like the vast majority of the people in third class were immigrating from somewhere in Europe to either the US or Canada. And so on most other North Atlantic passenger ships at the time, third class accommodations consisted of little more than open dormitories in which hundreds of people were confined, often without adequate food or toilet facilities. White Star Line vessels provided their third class passengers with private, small but comfortable cabins capable of accommodating 2, 4, 6, 8, or 10 passengers, just depending on how many people were traveling in that one family or in that group. They also had their own dining rooms and public deck space, so they didn't just have to stay down in the hold of the ship for the entire time. They were allowed to go outside, which was like insane for the time.
We should let the pores have some air.
Yeah.
Nah.
Their meals were also provided by the ship. On other ships, they would have been expected to bring their own food. And then this part is going to become a problem later. So they were like physically separated from the rest of the ship by metal gates, which were normally kept closed. And then during the panic following the collision, the stewards did not have time to open all of the gates, which left many of the third class passengers stuck below decks. So,
oh my God,
that was a problem later.
I hate that so much.
Yeah, and so, we went over all like the pretty stuff. So just some important points about its construction or design that are going to become important later. So it was not built to be unsinkable. Like that was not the goal. The goal was for it to be the largest ship and for it to be like the most luxurious for all of the classes that they offered, right? And so just keep that in mind later on. And so the first actual construction point that I think is important to remember is that it is steel held together with rivets, right? So the next one is the one that we're going to talk about a whole lot more later. So all 3 of the Olympic class ships had 16 compartments in the hull, which were divided by 15 bulkheads. And bulkheads they're just walls. It's like the nautical term for a barrier. And so if you can go to the next slide, you can kind of see on the bottom of that diagram on slide 11, you can see where those compartments are. And so in theory, 4 of these compartments could be filled with water and the ship would not sink. Again, that's a theory. I couldn't find any information on whether this was like a brand new idea or whether it was used in other ships like in other companies or even in other lines within White Star Line. I couldn't figure that out. So I don't know how commonly this was used. Just in the Titanic and her sister ships, this was what was used. And then we're going to discuss those in more detail later. And then the ship was outfitted with 20 lifeboats. So 14 of them were wooden. So if you can go to slide 12, this is just a picture of the wooden lifeboats. So yeah, it was 14 of them were wooden lifeboats. These had rudders, oars, and anchor. I typed ripe. I put ripe instead of rope. Rope, fresh water, a mast and a sail, a compass, and a lantern. So they were like fairly equipped, right? And then they also came with like a store of fresh water and food in case of emergencies. So 2 of the lifeboats were cutters, which is a kind of a sailboat. So you can go to slide 13. This is a cutter. This is not, I could not find a picture of the same kind of one that was used on the Titanic, but it's a boat with a sail. Basically is all you need to know.
Yes.
These were...
It also looks like I don't know what you call it, like the bow and the rudder are deeper than a regular rowboat.
Yeah.
Like it goes into the water more.
Yeah.
They're like deeper and they come to more of like a point, like where like the 2 sides meet. It's more of a point. It's why it's, I assume, I do not know.
That's what it looks
It looks like
yeah.
a little knife.
But I assume that's why it's called a cutter, is because it like cuts through the water.
Through the waves. Yes, exactly.
We're sailors.
We're so smart.
My dad was in the Navy for 3 days.
Right? Hold on. Give me 2 seconds.
No, you're fine.
Gypsy just shoved my door open for whatever reason. So.
You're good. That was a fun noise.
Gypsy, why are you here?
She wants to say hi.
Because I love you.
Yeah. She squealed like a stuck pig again when I came by this morning. It's only with me. She squeals like we are torturing this poor dog because she's just so excited.
A dork.
She's such a dork. I thought it was with everybody, and then like last summer I found out, no, it's only me.
Yeah, she's very quiet when I'm there.
Yeah, it's only me. It's very strange.
All right. I just have a question.
Okay, what's your question?
Not for you.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was like, I can answer it probably.
No, because you don't know what I need to. I'm trying to submit my thesis right now.
Okay, I thought it was for me.
No. I'm just
Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
trying to figure out what I'm supposed to title this. Anyway, keep going.
Okay, so 2 of the lifeboats were cutters, which are kind of sailboat. These, at least on the Titanic, these cutters were smaller than the wooden lifeboats, but they came with like basically the same equipment. They came with like 1 less coil of rope or something. Like it wasn't any huge difference. And then the other 4 lifeboats were collapsible Engelhart lifeboats, and Engelhart is like a last name. So if you can go to slide 14, this is one of them collapsed. You can see how the sides, it's made out of canvas and, is it Kapok? K-A-P-O-K? Kapok? I don't know how to pronounce that.
Yeah, I don't know. I've only
I
ever
don't
seen
know,
it in
but
writing.
I know, I have too. But so they're canvas.
We're Air Force brass. We're like the last people you should be asking.
Right.
So they're made out of canvas, and shockingly, they collapse, which is why they're called collapsibles. So they're more like rafts than they are like true boats, right? Because they're collapsible, and they're smaller even than the cutter or than the regular lifeboats. And so these did not have a mast or a sail, and they steered using a steering oar rather than a rudder. And so my understanding of that is a rudder is like under the water, correct? And then a steering oar is going to be something more higher up in the water line is how I understand it. That might be wrong.
Yes.
I didn't look that much into it. But again,
Sounds right.
yeah, but again, the rest of the equipment was basically the same. This equipment was kept in locked boxes on the deck out of fear of theft, which we will get into later.
Who the fuck is stealing a lifeboat?
I don't know. We're gonna talk about it
sorry.
more. No, you're
I'm
fine.
so-
Wait,
I'm
okay.
so
No,
upset
because
right
like there are so many decisions that were made where it's like, why did you make that decision? And so, in total, all 20 of these lifeboats could accommodate 1,178 people, which is only about half of the 2,208 on board, and roughly a third of the max capacity of the ship, which was 3,547. We're going to talk about that more later. I'm just giving giving context right now and important construction points that we need to think about later. So, I know. We'll get there, I promise.
So upset.
I know.
Right. Okay.
Okay,
Apparently
so,
it's K-pop.
okay. I wasn't sure if it's K-pop or Kapok, but It's like they sometimes use it for stuffing.
It's a
for,
plant
like,
fiber.
dolls. Yeah, it's a fiber.
It's just a plant fiber.
Yeah, and so, yeah, basically you just need to know it had canvas sides, which made it flat. Yeah, anyway, so the actual voyage. So if you can go to the next slide, this is a map of the route of the Titanic, in case you couldn't tell from the big title across the top. So, it left Southampton in England on April 10th, 1912, and made short stops in, I guess it's Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, which that is the town. It was changed. They now call it Cove, which is K-O-B-H.
Yeah, wonder
this
why.
Was changed. I know. Well, this was changed during the Irish War of Independence in the 20s.
Oh, shit. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, actually, like, because I looked it up because I was like, I don't know if there's anything I need to know because I was like, it's in Ireland. Queenstown doesn't sound like a very Irish name.
No.
And so, like,
get that shit out of here.
I know. I looked it up. Cove, K-O-B-H. It's not an Irish word. It's literally just the Irish spelling of cove. Like, that's it.
Yep.
And
like,
so, yeah.
name it whatever.
And so then it left Queenstown, now Cove, on April 11th, I believe. I didn't actually write it down. But yeah, maybe the 12th. I don't know. And then it began crossing the Atlantic to get to New York. And it planned to get to New York City on April 17th. So it had around 885 crew members and approximately 1,317 passengers. So these are all estimates. There were about 324 people in first class, 284 in second class, and 709 in third class. So the number of passengers cannot be completely verified. A lot of passengers canceled or booked their trips at the absolute last minute. And since everything was a paper record, it was really easy to get it wrong, especially since people were getting on in 3 different cities in almost 3 different countries, you know? So it's just records weren't as exact as we would prefer. And then of the crew members, the vast majority were casual workers who had only come aboard like right before the ship sailed from Southampton. This was the norm at the time. Ships typically didn't have permanent crews. It also makes it so that we don't know exactly how many crew members were on board. And then additionally, with the crew and the staff, the vast majority of the staff were not sailors. So most were professionals of some other career, such as like engineers, firemen, bakers, stewards, laundresses, etc., stuff like that, which becomes important later as well. So even with this amount of people on board, they were way under capacity because the boat could probably hold another 1,000 people, which is really weird for a maiden voyage of a ship. But there was a national coal strike in the UK that spring, which had disrupted shipping schedules. So that was why there were so, like, relatively few people on board. Relatively. There could have been a whole lot more. And then, as I kind of said earlier, there were a shit ton of well-known people on board, but most notably for right now is J. Bruce Ismay, who was the son of Thomas Ismay, who we discussed earlier, who bought the White Star Line. So Bruce Ismay was the current head of the White Star Line, and Thomas Andrews, who designed the ship. So if you can go to the next slide, the guy on the left is Ismay, the guy on the right is Andrews. And so with every person I mention, I am going to tell you whether or not they survived, like immediately. So Ismay survived, Andrews did not. And so I didn't know where to stick this, but I wanted to bring it up. So one of these well-known people was a silent film actress named Dorothy Gibson. So if you can go to the next slide, this is Dorothy Gibson. So she did survive. And later that month, wrote and starred in a silent film called Saved from the Titanic, in which she wore the same clothing she had worn on the night of the sinking, which is what this picture is of.
Traumatic.
The film was released 29 days after the sinking.
Holy shit.
Yeah, and like her manager was just like, do you want to do this? And she was like, I guess. But then this was the last thing she was ever in because she had a mental breakdown right afterward.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Wonder fucking why.
Yeah.
Oh
That's
my god.
called trauma, friends.
Yeah. And so the film itself was super successful.
Oh, I'm
but
sure.
all known prints were destroyed in a fire in 1914, which is pretty common for the silent film era because the kind of film they used was super flammable. So this happened a lot. And so going back to the actual voyage, so the first 3 days of the voyage were uneventful. The only thing that happened that was bad, I guess, a coal fire had started about 10 days before launch and then continued to burn for several days into the voyage, but passengers weren't aware of it. Coal apparently likes to set itself on fire, so fires on coal-burning ships were like, that happened all the time. Like, that wasn't new. That was something that they knew how to handle. The fire was extinguished on April 14th, and there's speculation as to whether the fire and attempts to extinguish it made the ship more vulnerable. I personally don't think so, but, like, I'm also not in a position to rule anything out. So, you know.
That doesn't sound like it would make the ship more
Yeah.
vulnerable, but
Who knows?
I guess I could see how it would.
Yeah, who knows? So on April 14th, which is the day of the sinking, the ship received 6 warnings of drifting ice, but Captain Edward Smith chose to ignore them. So if you can go to slide 18, which is the next slide, this is Captain Smith. And so I do want to give some context here as to why he ignored these, because there is a reason. It wasn't because he was being negligent. So they were really banking... I have a couple points here. So they were really banking on those watertight compartments, saving their asses if they did hit something. But more importantly than that, at the time, it was generally believed that ice didn't pose a danger to large vessels. And so in 1907, the SS Kronprinz Wilhelm, I suppose, a German liner, had rammed an iceberg head on, but had been able to complete her voyage. And Captain Smith himself had declared in 1907 that he, quote, could not imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Additionally, it was practiced at the time to operate close to full speed, and ice warnings were taken as, like, advisories rather than an actual warning, or rather as, you know, because, like, nowadays, if you're like, hey, there's ice, it's like, okay, we're gonna go real slow so that we don't hit any ice, right? They were like, we're just going to keep going because ice isn't going to hurt us. And even if it does, we have those watertight compartments. We'll be fine.
Yeah.
It's kind of hubris.
The plan was to just ram through it.
Yeah, basically. It's, you know, human error, hubris, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't negligence and it wasn't malice. It was just ignorance.
It was also probably just a little bit of, like, we don't understand how ice works.
Exactly. Because they didn't.
In that, like, the iceberg can be larger underneath the water.
Exactly. They didn't understand it. So, like, yeah, I mean, it's really easy to say, like, oh, he should have done this. And, like, looking back, yes, obviously. But at the time, he was working with the information that he had.
Yeah, so.
So, yeah. And so with that, they were going full speed ahead. And the ship was going, well, almost full speed ahead. They were going at 22 knots, which is about 25 miles per hour or 41 kilometers per hour when the iceberg in question was spotted. So, the sinking. At 11:40 p.m. ship's time on April 14th, lookout Frederick Fleet, who survived, spotted an iceberg and alerted the bridge. So if you can go to slide 19, Frederick Fleet is on the left. First Officer William Murdoch, who is on the right and who he ended up not surviving. He was basically the one, like, controlling the ship. The captain was awake. He was just not on the bridge at the time. He attempted to maneuver around the iceberg, but it was kind of too late for them to do anything. So it was less than a quarter mile away from the bow of the ship, which the bow is the front. The engines were immediately thrown into reverse, and the rudder was turned to make a hard left because the iceberg was on their starboard side, which is the right side of the ship. So they were going to make a left while backing up to get away from it. But with the ship being so big, it was too slow. And I got that explanation of it I took from that SimScale article. It is speculated that if he had turned while maintaining forward speed, the ship would have missed the iceberg, but that is just speculation. So, the starboard side, which again is the right side, of the Titanic struck the iceberg, which created a series of holes below the waterline. So it basically separated the steel sheeting of the hull and allowed water to slowly seep in, and six of the ship's... I know. There's a lot of S's right now.
Right.
Excuse me. 6 of the watertight compartments were breached, and remember that only 4 could safely be breached. And so, excuse me, before we continue, I do want to do a note on Murdoch, he was the one who was controlling the ship. He's the one on the right. So we don't actually know how he died.
Lovely.
But there's a good chance it was by suicide on board the Titanic as it was sinking. And so... among the earliest reports of the sinking, at least 2 passengers, one was a third-class passenger named Eugene Daly, and one was a first-class passenger named George Rhymes. They both claimed to have seen one of the ship's officers shoot 1 or 2 men during a rush for the lifeboat, which we'll get into the whole men can't go on the boat thing later. And then they saw him commit suicide by shooting himself during the last minutes that the ship was afloat. And it is widely believed that Murdoch was that officer. And so there's an author who I didn't look into this guy. I'm assuming he's a Titanic expert of some kind. His name is Tim Malton. He writes that although the evidence is circumstantial, quote, it does seem that an officer did shoot himself and Murdoch seems the most likely candidate. As Titanic experts Bill Wormstead and Tad Finch point out, Murdoch was the man directly in charge of the ship in the hours leading up to the collision with the iceberg, and he was therefore responsible for the ship and all of its passengers during that time. His career at sea was effectively over, even if he survived the disaster, end quote.
Well, and isn't it, and I know this is not real, but, like, isn't it a thing that, like, the captain always goes down with the ship?
I mean, the captain did. He's not the captain. He's the first officer. Yeah, the captain
but
did go
still,
down with the ship. Yeah.
But still, like, he's the one in charge at the time, so. Like,
yeah, and I mean, can you imagine how guilty he must have felt, even without his
yeah.
career being over? Like, yeah, and so.
Well, and at that point, like, yeah, that's like
he
2 hours worth of people screaming. Like,
yeah.
I'd be like, yeah, no, I'm done.
Yeah, he was gonna die either way. It's just, and so with Murdoch, though, before he died, he was in charge of the lifeboats on the starboard side of the ship, which we will get into more later. So Captain Smith heard and felt the collision. Like, everyone on board who was awake, because it was almost midnight, they felt it. They just didn't know what it was. The passengers, anyway. So this captain heard the collision and immediately went to the bridge. He summoned Thomas Andrews, who was the Titanic's builder. He was there to just, like, supervise everything for the maiden voyage. And so if you can go to slide 20, so these are GIFs that show, like, the progress of the ship as it sank. If you don't want to watch that, either don't go to it or go to the next slide after that. I don't really care. So they went and inspected the damage. So within 45 minutes of the collision, about 13,500 long tons, I don't know how that's different than a regular ton, it's a shit ton of water regardless, of water had entered the ship, which was too much for the bilge pumps to handle. So basically, there's too much water coming in. Ships have pumps that let you pump out excess water. It was just too much for those pumps to handle. And then Andrews estimated that the ship would only stay afloat for another 2 hours, which he was correct about. And so, like, the captain knew, a good chunk of the officers knew, the passengers did not know what was going on. And then the quartermaster, which quartermaster on a ship, they're basically in charge of, like, the supplies. The quartermaster was, one of them anyway, was so unaware of what was happening that after evacuation started, he phoned the bridge to ask why he had just seen a lifeboat go past. So they were trying to keep everybody as calm as they could, but that may have backfired later on. So, excuse me. The first lifeboat was launched at about 12:45. So this was a.m. on the 15th. Between 2:10 and 2:15 a.m., the rate of sinking increased as the boat deck slipped underwater. And so the boat deck was, I don't think it was the topmost deck that was exposed. I think it was like the next deck down. So it wasn't like open to the sky or anything, if I remember correctly. And so as it sank down, the stern, which is the back of the ship, rose out of the water and the propellers were exposed. At 2:20 a.m., the ship broke in 2 pieces between the second and third funnels. So the bow of the ship, which was already fully underwater when it broke, and just sank down into the ocean. The stern, which again is the back, it was full of air, and so it stayed vertically afloat for another few minutes, but then obviously it also sank. All of those who had not made it into a lifeboat were immersed in lethally cold water. And that was how every website explained it was lethally cold.
I hate that.
So it was -2 degrees Celsius or 28 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah. That is basically the summer temperature of Lake Superior.
It's not good. So
and as I told Shannon earlier today, you could not pay me to spend more than 2 minutes in Lake Superior. No. Because my family goes up north in the summer. We have family up there that's like on Lake Superior, and basically you go in the lake when you are severely sunburned, and you go in for like 2 seconds.
Yeah, just to get the heat out of you. Yeah.
And if
Dude,
you are
you
in
need
for
to-
longer than that, like, no.
Yeah.
When you guys come up here, I'm going to have you put your feet in the ocean
Yeah.
in Maine.
No, thank you.
It's worse because I've been to Lake Ontario in the summer. I get that it's cold, but it is nowhere near as cold as the ocean is in Acadia.
Yeah. Like-
That
Oh,
is,
I
like,
believe it.
Yeah.
bullshit is
Yeah.
how cold it is.
Like,
Everyone's
imagine-
like, beach day! And I'm like, you can't touch the water!
No,
It's
like, you'll die.
toxic. with
You'll literally
cold.
die. And so when water is this cold, it typically causes death within minutes from cardiac arrest or something called cold incapacitation. So this is the inability to use your limbs and your hands as the body is protectively shutting those down in order to protect your core. People usually don't die of hypothermia because they don't live long enough to do so.
Yeah.
So,
So-
if you do fall into water this cold, my dad has like taught us all this kind of like weird survival training shit. But
Same.
don't freak out right away because
Nope.
people who fall into cold water will like take a quick breath because
Yeah,
they're
don't do
so
that.
shocked by it. Just stop your body entirely. Just sit there for a second. Wait until your limbs are done freaking the fuck out, and then you can swim.
Yeah.
Yes.
It works.
You have
That's
to,
what
like,
kills a lot of animals in water. It's like they're so cold, they're just like, holy shit.
Yeah.
They-
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it's
what
the,
happened
like-
with all these people.
it's the shock of being in something so cold, and yeah, you have to like give your body a minute to acclimate, and then you can like
Then you
your
can
brain
move.
can take control again.
Yeah. Just in this case, everyone was already panicking, and many people
Well, yeah.
didn't know how to swim. So, like, that's also a problem.
Well,
So,
yeah. Also,
yeah.
like, I know it was the middle of the night, but if anyone was like upper class, even then, like the clothes that you sleep in as an upper class person,
yeah, they would have weighed you down.
they just weigh you down.
Yeah.
Or like if you had like boots on of any kind, that's just
Mm-hmm.
immediate like buckets on your feet.
Yeah.
Weigh me down in a ton of furs.
Oh my
I'm gonna
god.
rewrite that to be
Okay,
about
but
the
also-
Titanic class passenger. With the Titanic. Hold on.
Speaking
Papa,
of-
give me a piece of paper.
Just I may be like deathly afraid of the ocean and open water, but I also want a Viking funeral.
Oh god. Okay.
Just like
That's legal in
Set
Maine
me-
now. That's legal in Maine. I will
just set me
straight
on
up-
fire and set the
Oh,
boat
man.
afloat.
Alright. Okay.
So
So, I'm just gonna move on. So, throughout the sinking, they obviously sent out distress signals by the wireless radio. They used rocket flares and they just like flashed lamps around the ship. But every ship in the vicinity was too far away. The RMS Carpathia, which if you can go to the next slide, that is the Carpathia. They showed up at around 4 a.m. and rescued the lifeboats. It took 4 or 5 hours to get everybody on board. And then there was some controversy surrounding another nearby ship, but we're going to talk about that later. And then just as a side note, the Carpathia was owned by the White Star Line's biggest competitor. It's not like relevant. I just thought it was interesting, so I wanted to bring it up.
yeah.
And so about 710 people survived, while at least 1,500 died. And we're going to get into more of the nitty gritty of those numbers later on. And then this is just a quote. So the Carpathia's captain described the area as an ice field that had included 20 large bergs measuring up to 200 feet high. And that's 61 meters, in case people don't, in case you're normal and use the metric system. And there were numerous smaller icebergs, as well as ice floes and debris from the Titanic. Passengers described being in the middle of a vast white plain of ice studded with icebergs, and this area is now known as Iceberg Alley. So there was just a shit ton of icebergs around. So now, that's basically it, right? They got rescued, they went to New York, we're going to get into the aftermath of everything later. So now we're going to talk about the reasons for the sinking and for the large loss of life, because it was too many, obviously. So if you can go to the next slide, this photo is like, we're pretty sure this is on slide 22, this is the picture of the iceberg that hit the Titanic. And apparently it had like, it had red paint on its side, which that was how, because it had scraped along the side.
Yeah.
And so as we discussed a little bit earlier, the like understanding of ice was very different than it is now.
I love that, like, people back in the day didn't know shit about dick, and, like, we still don't know anything.
I know.
And it's just really funny to me, like,
How have
What
we lived
is
this
ice?
long? Yeah.
I know. How are we apex
How have we
predators?
lived this long?
I don't
Yeah.
get it.
Literally, I was actually listening to the Violet Jessup episode earlier today because I am behind on our own podcast. But so, and I got to the part where me and Hannah were just like, learn how to build a ship, learn how to drive a ship.
Yeah.
And then
What a fucking idiot.
and then I look at this and I'm like, how do you not know how ice works?
I
It's
know.
the 1900s, you
Dumb bitch.
idiots. And then I look at like America today and I'm like, okay, but we
Okay,
don't know
I
how
get
a
it,
virus
though.
works.
Yeah, like I get
get
it
it.
now.
Because I almost called him Al Gore. What's his name? Who's the one putting trackers in us?
Huh? Our president?
No,
Or do you mean
no.
Dr. Fauci?
You mean Fauci?
No, the other one.
There's
Bill
another one.
Gates.
Oh,
Bill
Bill
Gates.
Gates,
I was
yeah.
like, who's the other one?
Sorry.
When did
I
we get
can't even-
another one?
It was like, there's too many conspiracy theories.
I know.
Oh god, shut it down.
Oh, that does. So I'm not going to talk about them here. I might do it in a VSC. There are conspiracy theories around the Titanic. I didn't
Oh,
feel
heck yeah.
that it was appropriate to discuss those while also discussing what actually happened out of respect for the victims. So we're going to
Yeah,
talk about
please
those
don't.
in a
Fair.
separate. Plus, this is already really fucking long. So
Yes.
yeah, with
If
ice.
Shannon had added one more like page of notes, me
They
and
wouldn't
Hannah
have
were about
recorded
to
with me.
riot.
They wouldn't have recorded with me. So, on top of not understanding ice, additionally, the ice conditions in the North Atlantic were the worst in 50 years. So,
Cool.
which is the reason why the lookouts were unaware that they were about to steam into a line of drifting ice several miles wide and many miles long. And then just some other stuff with ice and the weather and all that. So weather reports were considered to be a secondary concern to the radio and telegraph officers, as their primary job was to send messages for the passengers. Not the best way to go about that, but that was how things were done at the time. Additionally, North Atlantic liners as a group prioritize timekeeping above all other considerations, which is part of the reason why they're going at as close to full speed as they can. And then at the time of the collision, the water was completely calm. It's known now that exceptionally calm water is a sign of nearby pack ice, but they didn't know that at the time. And then on top of that, because of a mix-up in Southampton, the lookouts had no binoculars, but binoculars wouldn't have helped.
What?
Binoculars would not have helped because there was no moon, there were no waves to hit the ice.
I know.
So they couldn't
I
see
know.
anything.
That doesn't matter.
Yes.
If you're a lookout, you need fucking binoculars.
Yes. And so the lookouts, I mean, they had gotten, like, they knew that there was potentially ice around, but they didn't know how much, you know? And so, like, they were looking for ice, but there isn't really a whole lot they can do about it if they see it.
I know. I'm talking about
I
daytime
know.
lookout. When
Yeah,
that's
It's like
your
basic
fucking
lookout duties.
job.
I'm like, you're just relying on these guys who like. I'm sorry that
I hope
probably
you have
haven't seen
20/20
an
vision.
eye doctor in like
Ever.
ever,
Eye doctors were
I
a
was
thing
thinking
at
about
the
that
time.
today.
right?
Like how in the old days, all three of us blind at. Well, no, Shelby, you have good eyes, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You and I would
I was
be
like, don't
fucking
include me.
dead.
Oh my god.
I was
no,
like, why
dude.
don't we ever hear about people with poor eyesight back in the day?
I
And then
don't know.
It's probably
They
no,
probably
here's
didn't
why.
know,
I've figured
but-
it out. No, it's because
They
you
probably,
probably
like, fell
walked
off a
into the
horse.
river as a kid, and
True.
that's it. That's the end.
Probably.
You're like, is that the road?
Nope. Yeah. I can literally see 6 inches in front of my face. Everything after that is a flat blur of light and some color. Like, I can't
See,
even
I
pick
don't-
out colors because it all
I
just
was
blends
that
together.
kid who straight up like purposely stared at the sun and purposely read in the dark because I wanted to ruin my eyes because I wanted glasses. And yes, I'm aware that that was a stupid thing to do, and I don't do it,
didn't
anymore.
do to you,
Obviously.
it didn't do
Well,
anything
when
to
you
you,
get
though.
cataracts when you're old.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm sure, like, by the time I hit 35, my eyes are going to be like, you remember that time when you were 6? But even with doing all of that, like, my eyesight has not changed since I was 6 years old. Like, I
Yeah.
have a slight, like the slightest astigmatism in one of my eyeballs, and that is it.
Shut the hell your mouth.
Yeah, I literally
Okay,
had to
well,
get
if
my
it makes
eyes
you
checked.
feel better, my eyes don't dilate correctly, and
That's
so
true.
it gives me chronic migraines.
Yeah,
so.
and you can't drive at
Yeah,
night.
sorry, that
so,
does suck.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
What am I looking at? Oh, yeah.
it's like, it's not blurry, but you also can't see because your vision blacked out.
Yeah.
So,
Trade-offs.
right? The pros and cons.
It's fine. So, we're done with the ice now. We're done with ice. So, the next issue with the
Eyes.
Titanic. I did eyes and ice. Both. We're done with both.
Sorry, I'm
No,
just
I know.
gonna do all
It's
the
fine.
stupid bad puns
No,
today.
I want some levity to break this up. Like,
Okay, then I have a quick question. Do you
Okay.
know, did the band on the Titanic have a name?
let me look it up real quick.
Didn't
they
they
were just
play
the
music
Titanic
as the
orchestra.
ship was sinking?
Yes, they
To,
did.
like,
I'm trying
calm
to write
people
it into
down.
my If I Die Young lyrics over here.
No, they did. Hang on. I think they were just called the musicians of the Titanic. I don't think they had a name, like a band
Okay.
name. You know, because I mean they weren't
if you
like.
send me those lyrics, I will sing it and record it and send
Yeah,
it to you.
so they weren't members of like a band altogether. They were different musicians who worked separately,
Yeah.
basically, who got contracted to work on the
God,
Titanic.
they were so fucking young.
They were very young. Yes.
Babies.
The oldest one was
Cellist
40.
was a literal infant.
Yeah, the oldest one was 40. The youngest was 20.
20.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
cellist. The little French cellist.
Yes.
Oh,
Um,
the child.
Yeah. I don't
Precious
go.
angel baby.
Yeah, I don't talk about them that much, just because we already had so much other stuff, and because we basically
Yeah.
just covered the whole thing. We don't actually like. There's actually debate. Like, people have tried to find out what song they were playing as the ship went down. They think it's "Nearer My God to Thee," but they can't
Okay.
confirm it.
Whoa. Everyone stop. I have a quick thing about that.
Okay.
So, I know.
No, you're
Listen to
fine.
me. Hear me out.
Yeah.
First of all, I just pulled out a card that has 4 crosses, a Star of David, and 3 hammers and sickles on it. Don't know
Oh
where that
God.
came from.
Okay.
Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh, so Nearer My God to Thee. First of all, Hoover made us play that every single fucking year.
Yeah,
no
I
matter
know.
what. Rain or shine. We always played Nearer My God to Thee, so I already have like trauma. But did you know?
I grew up a
when
church
the
kid, so
world-
trauma.
Yeah, well, when the world ends, like when nuclear Armageddon is about to happen, all of the broadcasting stations are going to go to this old ass recording. I think it was recorded in like the 70s or 80s of a band standing in the front of the White House playing "Nearer My God to Thee" as like missiles rain down on us.
I
Just
don't
so you
like
know,
that. I
you
don't
can
like
look
that.
up the footage.
No,
It's
I believe
horrifying.
you. I don't like that.
I
don't like that at all.
It's so scary.
Don't like
It's
that at
horrible.
all.
Yeah, I don't
Anyway,
like that. I
I
regret.
could have gone my whole life without that knowledge.
I
Okay.
regret mentioning
You're
"Nearer My
welcome.
God to Thee" now. That was a big mistake. Okay.
I mean, I played on the piano like once a week, but still, it's like every time I
mean,
do,
it's
I
an
think
easy
about it.
song to play, but
Yeah.
It is. It's a fun, like, just a warm-up piece, but then
yeah.
I have bad thoughts after.
Oh God.
Well, and if
Okay.
you think about it, like, that would have been a song that all of them would have known at that time,
Yeah.
too. Like,
Yeah.
without music, and, like, you can just... It's kind of like... I could probably play the national anthem or Pop and Circumstance, even though I haven't touched my clarinet
Yeah.
in
God, guess
10 years.
Yeah.
Like,
guess what I played today on my flute?
What?
The piccolo solo from Star. I had a big time with it.
oh my gosh. Stars and
I know,
Stripes
I've been playing my
Forever
flute a lot
or
recently.
Sleigh Ride.
Ugh,
Yeah,
fucking
Shannon
hate Slayer. Right?
hates. Yeah, Shannon
It's
hates
too
I know.
high. Okay,
I
can we
know.
move on, please? We're already an hour in and we're only on page 9. Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, we're done with the icebergs. Now we're going to move on to the issues with the steel plates and the rivets that were on the hull. So, investigation after the fact has revealed that the rivets and the steel were faulty. What a shock. So, the steel itself... I know, the steel itself was too brittle. So, pieces recovered from the wreckage showed that they had
Cool.
shattered upon impact, whereas they should have bent. And so, researchers in, like, the 90s, I want to say... They used a technique called a Charpy test to test the brittleness of the steel that made up the Titanic's hull. So if you go to slide 23, these are pictures from that test. So the way they do this test, and I got all of this from that Penn State engineering article. What? Why are you giggling?
Just reminds me. It reminds me of the wall test in band.
Yeah. So the
Wait,
way...
what?
The wall test where you take your reed and you smash it against
jam
the
it into the
wall. And
wall.
if it,
Yeah.
quote unquote doesn't survive, then you need a new reed. But like
it never survives because it's a
big
fucking
joke.
reed.
And it's the wall.
Yeah.
Okay, that was never a thing after I left at any of my other schools. But anyway, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so the way they do this test, they take a cigarette-sized piece of the metal and they call this piece of metal a coupon. So they hold it against steel backing and they strike it with a 67-pound pendulum on a 2.5-foot long arm.
Shit.
So for the piece of the Titanic's hull, because they've been bringing shit up from that wreckage ever since they discovered it. So
Yes.
for that piece, they tested it against modern steel, and they placed both pieces in a bath of alcohol at -1 degree Celsius to simulate conditions on the night of the sinking. And so this is a quote directly from that Penn State engineering article. When the coupon of the modern steel was tested, the pendulum swung down and halted with a thud. The test piece had been bent into a V, and so that's that picture on the right. However, when the coupon of the Titanic steel was tested, the pendulum struck the coupon with a sharp ping, barely slowed, and continued up on its swing. The sample, broken in 2 pieces, sailed across the room. And so that's the picture on the left. And so this is a type of catastrophic failure that's in a lot of structural materials. And so impact at extremely high speeds, when combined with low temperature, high impact loading, and high sulfur content, causes the material to shatter rather than bend. And that is from that SimScale article. And so the issue this causes is that when the steel hit the iceberg, it didn't deform, it broke. If it had simply deformed or bent, the hole would not have been breached because it would have just made like a dent. But instead, this made a hole, which is how that water all got in. So obviously that's a problem. And so on top of that, the rivets were bad. And so if you can go to slide 24, this is one of the rivets from the Titanic that they got from the wreckage. So they were
I love that it has a tiny little base there.
Yeah. So these were made of wrought iron and they fastened the steel plates to the Titanic's frame. And so the impact of the iceberg, it was a scrape, right? Like they scraped along the side. They didn't hit it. And so I included this. You guys didn't really watch SpongeBob. There's a SpongeBob episode really early on in the show where they're like sailing a ship through a canyon with SpongeBob saying like, you're good, you're good, you're good. And then at the end, the whole thing is just like gone because the ship got broke away.
Okay, I do remember that.
And then he says,
with the Flying Dutchman?
yes, yeah. And then he says, don't worry, Captain, we'll buff out those scratches. It's like that. It scraped. It was bad. And so that was just the first thing I thought of. I feel bad comparing this to the Titanic, but that's all I got. And so the scrape...
I mean, it's kind of the same.
It's a good visual of what happened. And so the scrape caused the rivets to be sheared off, which opened up seams in the metal like a zipper.
Oh my god.
Yeah, and because...
That visual just...
Yeah,
Woo.
it's bad. And there's a couple reasons for that. So the below freezing water temperature had also caused the rivets to become brittle. And then modern tests of recreations of the rivets showed that they didn't hold as much as they should have. So this is a quote from an ABC News article. The rivets were put to the test by simulating the amount of pressure the Titanic's hull would have been under after the collision. These rivets should have been able to hold between 16,000 and 20,000 pounds of load, Fecky said, and he's one of the researchers. What we found when we ran the tests of our simulated material is that it only held 9,000 pounds, which is about half of what it should have been holding. So basically,
Great.
So on top of the hull being breached because of the brittleness of the steel, the rivets physically could not hold the rest of it together, which is also part of the problem. And so I do want to note here, the size of like the gashes in the hull was debated for a really long time. And so basically until they discovered the wreckage of the Titanic in 1985, they didn't think that the ship had broken in half. They thought it had sunk down in one piece. There were quite a few eyewitnesses who said, no, it broke in half, but people like in positions of authority just refused to believe them for various reasons that we're not going to get into. And so everybody at the time, and up until 1985, thought that it was just this huge gash along the hull. And so the British inquiry following the incident stated that it must have been several gaps that extended along an area of roughly 300 feet in length. That's not what it was. So an ultrasound survey of the wreck conducted in the 1990s showed that the actual damage consisted of 6 narrow openings. That this math, I don't understand. So it covered an area of only 12 to 13 square feet. The longest gash is about 39 feet. I don't know how that mashes up. because I couldn't find like a diagram of the gashes. But either way, it's not 300 feet long. It's like maybe 40, right? It's not a big hole in the metal. And so like, even with that though, like the ship's in 2 pieces and it's eroding really bad. So it's kind of hard to like measure those gaps accurately. So they may have been a little bit longer, but it definitely was not a 300-foot gash along the entirety of the front of the ship. So, which like part of that is just like people at the time didn't want to admit that a small cut in the ship could have caused this much damage. So that was part of the estimate there. But I mean, they didn't even know where the wreck was. Like they couldn't go back and look at it later. And so we're done with that. Now we're going to go to those fucking compartments. So if you can go to slide 25. So this is a diagram that shows like different ways those compartments could be breached and the ship could still stay afloat. I just thought that was an interesting visual to have. Hannah, are you still there?
Yes, I'm laughing at a text my sister.
No, you're fine. I'm just checking.
Oh, wait. No, you two need to see this because you always make fun of me for things I say, and I'm going to show you that I...
What?
Send it in the group chat.
Okay.
Just keep talking, whatever.
Okay.
Get done with listening.
So, as I mentioned earlier, the lower section, like the very, very bottom of the ship, super deep underwater, was divided into 16 watertight compartments which could be easily sealed off if part of the hull was damaged. Excuse me. So after the iceberg collision, 6 of the compartments were damaged. And so this next part is a quote from that Penn State article. Sealing off the compartments was completed immediately after the damage was realized, but as the bow of the ship began to pitch forward from the weight of the water in that area of the ship, the water in some of the compartments began to spill over into adjacent compartments. Although the compartments were called watertight, they were only watertight horizontally. Their tops were open, and the walls extended only a few feet above the waterline. Which I yelled about this during the Violet Jessup episode. So basically, obviously, there's walls in between these compartments. They were not flush with the ceiling. There's a few feet of gap. I don't know why they did that. No one knows why they did that, but they did. So, as the ship was sinking, water needed somewhere to go because the ship was taking on more water. The water needed to expand because water fills the container that it's in. It was spilling over those walls to get deeper and deeper into the ship.
So basically flooding every compartment.
Basically, yeah. And so additionally, this is again a quote from that Penn State article, some of the scientists studying the disaster have even concluded that the watertight compartments contributed to the disaster by keeping the floodwaters in the bow of the ship. If there had been no compartments at all, the incoming water would have spread out and the Titanic would have remained horizontal. Eventually, the ship would have sunk, but she would have remained afloat for another 6 hours before foundering. That might be a conspiracy theory, but like that makes sense to me. But I don't like.
I could see it keeping the ship afloat. I don't know for 6 more hours.
Yeah,
that would take someone far more smart than me.
Yeah.
In how water and boats work, but
yeah.
It makes sense that it would keep it horizontal, at least.
Yeah, and yeah, at the very least, it would have kept it horizontal. And so, I mean, basically the issue with the compartments is that they weren't actually watertight, obviously, and potentially made it so that the bow was sinking, which made it break in 2 pieces. And it made it harder to load up the lifeboats. And so now we're going to talk about the lifeboats. So,
or lack thereof.
Yeah, so if you can go, we're still on slide 25 right now. Yes, we are. Okay. Just so everybody knows where we are. So,
yes. Talking to you directly, Hannah.
No, Shelby went ahead too. I was just making sure everybody knew where we were supposed to be.
Hannah was behind, Shelby was ahead.
Yeah.
A word for orchestra or ensemble that is less than 3 syllables, or it's not going to fit my song.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. So
I'm very invested in this.
Yeah, so just a bit of a heads up. We're going to be talking about the lifeboats for a very long time. So just settle in. We're talking about lifeboats for an absurd amount of time. So, as we stated earlier, there was not an adequate number of lifeboats on board. The Titanic had been designed to hold up to 64, but there were only 20 on board. So, this was not because of cost. Okay, the cost would have been like $16,000, which was a tiny fraction of the $7.5 million that they spent on construction. So, why were there so few? right? Like, that's obviously going to be the first question people ask afterward. So, in 1886, the British Board of Trade created safety regulations, which were updated in 1894. And these safety regulations said you had to have a certain amount of lifeboats per ton of volume on your ship, right? The issue was these regulations were intended to apply to vessels of up to 10,000 tons. And the Titanic and many other passenger liners at the time were far bigger than that. So the Titanic had a gross register tonnage of 46,328 tons, which is 4 times more than what the regulations, were supposed to apply to. And then 33 of the 39 British liners over 10,000 tons did not have enough lifeboats because of this lapse in regulation. And then the 6 that did, they were only marginally over 10,000 tons. This is the only reason why they had enough lifeboats. And so this is a quote from Wikipedia. The RMS Carmania was perhaps the worst of them, with only enough lifeboats for 29% of her occupants. Foreign ships, such as the German liner SS America and SS St. Louis, similarly only had enough lifeboat space for about 54 to 55% of those on board, which I just think that highlights it's not a Britain problem, it's a worldwide, we don't know how lifeboats work problem.
Yeah.
And then a random sampling of ships that exceeded 10,000 tons in 1912 of numerous different shipping lines in the US, Canada, and Europe showed that the ship that came closest to carrying enough lifeboats for all of its passengers was the French line's La Provence, which carried enough boats to accommodate 82% of her passenger capacity. So the reason they didn't have enough lifeboats was because nobody had enough lifeboats. This was not a specific to the Titanic failure. This was a entire industry failure. And so the regulations required a vessel of 10,000 tons or more to carry 16 lifeboats, sufficient for 960 people. So they actually were above what was required by 4 lifeboats. And so there was also
it's just about doing the bare minimum.
I know. Well, so there's a little bit more context to it.
How have humans survived this long,
I know.
y'all?
So at the time, additionally, like, sailors and shipbuilders had a low opinion of the usefulness in lifeboats in emergency because at the time, lifeboats were understood to ferry people from the sinking ship to the rescuing ship. They weren't meant to hold you for hours, right? Like, they weren't meant to be, we need to evacuate the entire ship en masse, everybody get into a lifeboat. That was not the understanding of lifeboats at the time. The understanding of the time was, the ship is sinking, we need to get people from dying ship to rescuing ship, basically. And so there was more emphasis on making the ship, quote unquote, unsinkable. So there wasn't like a lot of
because it was less
pressure.
that they didn't want to have to use the lifeboats because they're not.
They genuinely didn't.
Yes,
think
they are
would need
boats,
that.
but they are not. They are not meant for like travel.
Exactly.
And
exactly. They're not.
So it's
meant...
not like your regular rowboat or your regular sailboat or anything like that. It literally is a lifeboat, but still.
Like, didn't a lot of sailors not know how to swim? I know it's probably past that time.
I mean,
like,
it's probably
it was, like,
still
superstitious if you knew how to, like, not if you knew how to swim.
Well, I mean,
I'm trying to say, like,
remember, most of the crew
witches
had just joined in Southampton just as a job, so there's a good chance they were not professional sailors, right?
God, they were
Well,
like
because half the
street
crew
urchins who they're like,
had
hey,
been
get on the boat.
other professions.
Exactly. Most of the crew were not sailors. They were other professions. So...
Because quite frankly, especially with like a cruise ship, you don't really need sailors.
Nope.
You need, like cooks and
you need
like
stewards.
a wait staff.
You need people who do the laundry.
You need stewards
exactly.
and like a cleaning staff because it's a cruise ship. It's not. It's not a sailboat.
Exactly.
So you don't need people who like know how to work rigging and all that kind of stuff. Like
exactly. And so with all of this context, there wasn't a lot of pressure to change the regulations, and it was one of those instances where nothing had happened to force them to change the regulations, right?
And they probably didn't go through like a month's worth of training on what happens like most places do now.
We're going to get to the training for the lifeboats in a minute.
Yay!
So, as I kind of alluded to a little bit ago, on top of this different use of lifeboats than what we have now, the White Star Line never thought all of the passengers would have to evacuate en masse. And so the lifeboats, again, were designed to ferry people from the sinking ship to the rescuing ship. And so this had actually happened to another White Star Line ship during the Titanic's construction. So the RMS Republic was involved in a collision with another ship in January 1909 and sank. There weren't enough lifeboats, but the ship sank slowly enough that the lifeboats were able to ferry people to ships nearby that were assisting them. And so, keeping this use and understanding of lifeboats in mind, this led to harsh condemnation of Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian, who along with his crew saw the distress signals from the Titanic and basically ignored them, which that's the ship I mentioned earlier that there was a controversy with another nearby ship. And so, if they had showed up, the lifeboats could have been used to ferry people back and forth as was intended. And I do want to talk about the Californian real quick. So if you can go to slide 26, this is the Californian. So it also was surrounded by ice. It had actually sent a message to the Titanic earlier in the day to tell them that they were surrounded by ice, but the message never got to the captain due to human error. Plus, he had already gotten 6 other ones. Like, I don't think it would have done anything. And so, remember, they're becalmed. There's no moon. There's no lights. They can see lights from another ship, right? And so, they could see the lights from the Titanic. They knew that it probably was the Titanic, but they didn't know what was happening because they were kind of too far away. And so, like, the Titanic...
Well, yeah, I was going to say, if there's, like, no moon and the water is calm, it's kind of like when you're in, like, Kansas.
Yeah.
Or even here in Illinois, like, you can see for miles.
Yeah, and so...
like, yes, they're close, but they're also not close, if that makes sense.
Exactly. There's debate on how far away they actually were, but they could see lights from a ship, and we think it was the Titanic. And so the Titanic did send out distress rockets, right? Like flares.
Yeah.
They misunderstood what those were, and they thought that because there were different kinds of rockets used at the time that could signify, like, oh, I'm from this shipping line. You know, they thought it was one of those. They thought it was just a signal. They didn't think it was a distress rocket. And, like...
Oh my god, we need to have, like a consensus on what the fucking fireworks mean.
They did later. That was one of the things that got changed later. And so, like, they could tell that something was wrong.
How have humans survived?
Yeah, and so, like, they could tell that something was wrong with the ship, but they couldn't figure out what. And because they were surrounded by ice in the middle of the night in the dark, they were like, we're not going to go over there. And so...
I mean, fair.
Yeah, and so, like, at about 4 a.m, when the Carpathia got there, the Carpathia also sent out rockets just to tell the people in the lifeboats, like, hey, we're coming. They saw those. And then at about half an hour after the Carpathia arrived, they got a message from, I'm assuming, the Carpathia telling them, hey, the Titanic sank. You want to come and help us? And so they made their way there, but they got there so late, the Carpathia had already left. And remember, it took them 4 or 5 hours to load up the lifeboats. So it took them a very long time to get over there because of all of that ice.
Yeah.
And by the time they got there were empty lifeboats and corpses. And that was it. They couldn't do anything about it.
That's gotta be so spooky to see.
Yeah. And so they were shredded in the press after people found out about this. And they were interrogated by the American and British Inquiry. So, because after this happened, there was an American and a British inquiry. So, both of the inquiries found that the Californian must have been closer than the 19.5 miles claimed by Captain Lord, and that each ship was visible from the other. So, a lot of survivors said, they were like, we could see lights from another ship. They just didn't come over to us. And they think that that was the Californian. And so... and then, yeah, indeed, when the Carpathia arrived at the wreck site, a vessel was clearly seen to the north, which was later identified as the Californian. Both inquiries concluded that Captain Lord had failed to provide proper assistance to the Titanic, the British inquiry concluding further that California's responding to Titanic's rockets and going to assist might have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost. I don't think the all is true, but the many, I'm going to say that one's probably true.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Because it would have been, you know...
They would have
4
been
hours before
the Carpathia
well,
got
and
there.
Because the Carpathia took some time to get there too, so it would
they
have
were
been
really far away.
Yeah.
Well, and so like if they had showed up
sooner.
Because so the Titanic didn't start sending out distress signals until an hour after it started sinking, for various reasons. I don't know why, they just did. They could have gotten there in time for the lifeboats to be used as ferries as they were intended, right? But because we're going to get into loading the lifeboats pretty soon, I still don't know if it would have done much good, but it would have helped, right?
Yeah, I'm not saying they could have saved, like, everyone.
No, I don't think that they could have.
I don't think they could have.
No, I don't think that they could have. But they could have saved more, right? And so no formal charges were ever brought against anybody on board the Californian. And then this inquiry was actually like re-examined in 1992. And so this new one concluded that Captain Lord and the crew's actions fell short of what was needed. But they conceded that even if proper action had been taken, the Californian could not have arrived on the scene until well after the sinking. And it noted that when he did know of Titanic's distress, Captain Lord twice took his ship across an ice field to help search for survivors.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
Yeah, it's still debated today as to what they actually could have done without sinking themselves, right?
Because and
they were
it's
also
easy
in an ice
after
field.
the fact
Exactly.
to be like,
It's very
well,
easy
I
after
would
the
have done
fact.
this.
Exactly. It's very easy after the fact. And so I did just want to bring that up because a lot of the time when you talk about the Titanic, people bring up how the Californian failed to save them, and that's not necessarily the truth. It was just human error, honestly, and just a misunderstanding of what was happening. It wasn't that they actively chose not to go help, it's that they didn't know that they needed to go and help.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so going back to the lifeboats. The crew had not received adequate training. They'd only have one lifeboat drill, and it had been done while the ship was docked. It consisted of 2 boats being lowered, each manned by 1 officer and 4 men who merely rowed around the dock for a few minutes before returning to the ship.
Because that's training.
Yeah, and
There's a sea shanty about being a lifeboatman, and it's just about, like, this dumb bitch who keeps falling in the water because she wants to pretend that she needs mouth to mouth and then makes out with all the guys. I forget what her name is. It's like Sally Brown or something.
Yeah.
Props to that lady. She knows what she's wanting. She's willing to work for it.
I feel
I fell
and then,
again.
launches herself off the deck.
And so on top of this not adequate training, this is a quote from, I guess, Wikipedia, because I didn't write a source down. Lists had been posted on the ship allocating crew members to particular lifeboat stations, but few appeared to have read them or to have known what they were supposed to do. Most of the crew, in any case, were not sailors, and even some of those who were had no prior experience of rowing a boat. And
Can confirm after working in retail that no one ever reads the notes that you post.
Nope. And so, the crew at the time of the sinking were suddenly faced with the complex task of coordinating the lowering of 20 boats, carrying a possible total of 1,200 people 70 feet down the sides of a sinking ship.
Yeah.
And so Thomas E. Bonsall, who is a historian of the disaster, has commented that the evacuation was so badly organized that even if they had the number of lifeboats they needed, it is impossible to see how they could have launched them given the lack of time and poor leadership. And because of the way the boat was sinking, they couldn't even launch all of the boats that they had. So if you can go to the next slide, on slide 27, this is a diagram of where all of the lifeboats were on the boat. So there were 9 boats each on the port and starboard sides, and 2 of the collapsibles, so this was collapsible A and B, those were stored on the roof of the captain's quarters. So this is just where, this is where all the lifeboats were. So Officer Murdoch, who we mentioned earlier, he was the one who may have died by suicide. 3rd Officer Pittman, who he survived, and 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who also survived. They worked on the starboard side. So if you can go to the next slide, Pittman is on the left and Lowe is on the right.
Okay.
And then Officer Henry Tingle Wild, who he didn't survive, and 2nd Officer Charles Lightoller, who survived, work on the port side. So if you can go to the next slide, those are those 2.
Oh my god, that looks like my uncle, the one on the right.
Yeah.
That's weird.
And so, these were the 2 officers in charge on each side of filling up the lifeboats. There were other people working with them, but they were the ones who were calling the shots. So, as I'm sure anybody who's ever heard anything about the Titanic is aware, they followed the women and children protocol. So this means you load women and children. The issue was, Murdoch, who's on the starboard side, thought they were loading women and children first, while Lightoller, who was on the port side, thought they were loading women and children only. So, Lightoller lowered lifeboats with empty seats if there were not any women and children waiting to board, while Murdoch only allowed a limited number of men to board if all of the nearby women and children had already embarked. So the chances of a dude surviving depended on which side of the ship he happened to be on at the time.
Cool.
Shit.
Yeah!
Cool.
So each lifeboat was launched with at least one crew member to act as an officer or leader of the other passengers. This was typically somebody who already was an officer or somebody who was fairly high up in the crew. The they didn't begin launching until about 40 minutes to an hour after the ship struck the iceberg. And so almost all of the lifeboats were launched well under capacity, which there's reasons for it. So neither Murdoch nor Lightoller knew the safe capacity of the lifeboats and erred on the side of caution. So the wooden lifeboats, which there were 14 of those, right? So that had a max capacity of 68 people. And then the other kinds of lifeboats could hold roughly that same amount. If they had launched all boats to their max capacity, they probably could have saved around another 500 people. But they did not do that.
Damn.
Part of the reason why was because the passengers didn't fully believe or understand that the ship was sinking. So John Jacob Astor, who is an American millionaire, stated that we are safer here than in that little boat. He died in the sinking. His pregnant wife survived by escaping on a lifeboat. But they also, weren't told that the ship was sinking. Some of them noticed that the ship was listing to one side because it didn't sink straight down. It sank while tilting to the left, right? So there's also an angle on here while it's sinking down. And so, some of the passengers noticed this, but all of the passengers were basically told to put on their life jackets, or they called them life belts at the time. It was still a life jacket, essentially. But they were told to put on their life jackets and get to the nearest deck, but they were given no explanation as to why. And so another layer on top of this is that first class stewards. So these are basically I don't want to say servants, but they are people who are paid by the ship to assist passengers, right? Kind of like a flight attendant is now, except it's more hands-on because you're on a ship for 2 weeks. So
somehow I got
That's what Violet Jessup was.
You both talked at the same time. Hannah, you go.
Yes. No, it's okay. Somehow I got stuck in the what is it called? The stewardess. What are they called?
I have the lounge?
The cabin?
No, the people who work on the airplane.
The
flight
crew?
attendant. I got stuck on the flight attendant TikTok somehow. That's all my For You pages is freaking flight attendants and teachers.
Well, I live with a flight attendant.
Fine. It's very funny. They're hilarious people, but why and how?
Yeah.
Just wondering.
Shelby, what did you say?
That's a good question.
All right, cool. I'll find out later.
Already forgot. Oh, that's what Violet Jessup was. She was a stewardess.
So the first class stewards had fewer people to deal with, so they could provide hands-on assistance because, there wasn't necessarily more stewards based on the amount of people. So, yeah. The first class stewards had fewer people to deal with. They could provide hands-on assistance, right? So they could help people get to the deck. They could help people put their life jackets on. All that nonsense. So,
yes.
The second and third classes were basically told to put on their life jackets and go to the deck, and then were left to their own devices. They were given no explanation, and as I mentioned earlier, the stewards in the third class areas were so frantic and so busy that they left some of the gates closed, so people physically could not get out. And so, they weren't told what was going on. I mean, they just genuinely didn't know what was going on. It was also midnight and insanely cold outside, so they were like, "I'm not going out there."
Right.
And so the first lifeboat was launched off the starboard side at 12:40 a.m. That was lifeboat 7. We are going to go through all of the lifeboats now. I'm going to try to make it quick. So it only had 28 people aboard, but it could hold 65. And so, I meant to put this earlier. So additionally, in top of people just not knowing what's going on, some people thought that the whole thing was a drill or a joke. Some people were playing soccer with ice chunks that had been thrown onto the deck by the collision.
No.
And then it was also difficult to hear anyone speaking on deck because there was a lot of noise from steam being vented from the boilers. So it was just kind of chaotic, but also not because, the passengers didn't know what was going on. There were just a lot of external factors that were chaotic. And so lifeboat 7 was the first one to go. It only had 28 people. It was launched without its plug, so it was leaking water all night. Cool. So they had to sit with their feet in freezing cold water all night. One of the people on board wanted to rescue people from the water, but they were shouted down. And this boat eventually lashed up with boat 5. A lot of the boats kind of tied themselves together later on. And then this was the boat that Dorothy Gibson, who is a silent film actress, she was on this boat. So boat 5 left off the starboard side 3 minutes after boat 7. They had a lot of trouble getting down into the water. So the boats were launched off of a pulley system, and it wasn't an automatic system. It was manual. And so people had to be physically lowering the boats down and the ropes kept getting stuck. So this one had 36 people.
Well, I would imagine the ship being on that angle didn't help anything.
Yeah, at this point, it wasn't on too bad of an angle. Like, most of the passengers and the quartermaster hadn't even noticed yet.
Yeah.
Later on, that does become a lot more of an issue. At this point, it wasn't. It was just, this happened with like 4 or 5 other boats. The ropes just kept getting stuck in the pulleys. It just because, I don't know why. And so one of the officers on board was Herbert Pittman, who was the guy in the previous slide with the mustache. So he wanted to go back and rescue people, but the women on board protested. One of them said, "Appeal to the officer not to go back. Why should we lose all of our lives in a useless attempt to save others from the ship?" And this was a very common statement. Like, at least one person on each lifeboat said essentially this exact same thing. It's kind of terrifying. So Pittman relented, but he was haunted by guilt for the rest of his life. And so Boat 3 was launched off the starboard side at 1 a.m. with 38 people on board, and they had the same problems as Boat 5 did with getting down off the ship. So Boat 8 also launched at 1 a.m., but off the port side, which port is the left, starboard is the right, just to keep everybody, aware of what's going on.
Yes.
And it was beginning to tilt. Crap. I'll get to the tilt later. I can't remember which side it was tilting to. So, and at this point, it wasn't that bad. So it launched with 28 people. So this is the boat that the Strausses refused to get on. So if you can go to the next slide. Ida and Isidore Strauss refused to board while they were still younger people waiting. They were characters kind of in the Titanic movie. They were the old couple.
They were the old people.
Yeah, they were the old people. They were last seen hand in hand on the deck. They refused to get on until they were younger people. And then some of the people on Boat 8 wanted to go rescue people, but they were not able to convince others to do so. One of the people who wanted to rescue others was Lady, I think it's Roths, who's that woman on the right, and she just took charge of the whole thing. And her conduct was so admired by a crew member on board that they corresponded with each other for the rest of their lives. And so the occupants of Boat 8 spent the night rowing towards what they thought were the lights of a ship on the horizon, but then they turned around at daybreak when the Carpathia arrived in the opposite direction. And so they had traveled further from the scene than any other lifeboat, and it wasn't until 7:30 a.m. that they were picked up. They still weren't the last one to get picked up, though. So,
wow.
Yeah, so, and then just continuing on, Boat 1 was launched off the starboard side at 1:05 a.m. So if you can go to the next slide, I should have explained. What I'm doing with the boats is I am explaining how many people were on board, which side they launched off of, and well-known people on board, if any. Because I think it's interesting, and because I think it shows, I want to try to humanize everybody on this as much as I possibly can, And I just think that this is a good way to do it. Plus, I want to, give a nitty-gritty, this is why only 700 people survived, right? Boat by boat. So this lifeboat only contained 12 people. They had such a hard time getting people to board that they were just fuck it, we're going to launch it with 12. So 2 of these people were Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife Lucy, who was a famous dress designer. So they were reported as being really callous about the whole thing. Lucy apparently said to her secretary, "There's your beautiful nightdress gone." And then Sir Cosmo, after finding out that the crew's payment ended once the ship sank, promised to give all the crew on his lifeboat £5 when they were rescued, which he did, but some interpreted that to be a bribe to stop them from returning to the scene to rescue others. So these 2 were also shredded in the press for various reasons. Lucy was also... Yes.
I just know that, when I'm, scared or nervous, I start laughing, and...
Yep, me too.
I deal with things, in a humor way, so it could have just been you know what, I'm going to focus on this stupid nightgown, because that's the only thing I can let my brain wrap around at the moment.
Your nightgown.
Yeah.
Bodies.
So...
Yeah, it just, it's the 1912s... Or 1912s. God, it's the 1910s, and they're British aristocracy, so they're supposed to be the stiff upper lippy kind of people, and it just wasn't.
Yeah, and I get it, but just for our listeners or whatever,
we would do
take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah,
there's a chance I would make some stupid joke too.
Yeah, exactly.
In a life or death situation where I'd be like, "Oh look, my plane is crashing.
Exactly.
Look how stupid your mustache is." I don't know.
I'm not going to bring up the context into how this was discovered. most of the people in the lifeboats, by the time the ship sank, they thought everybody had gotten off safely. So she wasn't aware of the amount of deaths that were occurring around her additionally.
Yeah.
So, like...
the amount of immigrants locked in the basement.
Yeah, she didn't know. So, like, I get it, you know? And then Lucy was also the center of a precedent-setting contracts case in 1917, which we did read in contracts, but I could not and will not tell you what it's about. So,
Okay.
it was something with, like, the rights to her name or something. I didn't want to get into it. I fucking hated contracts. So, continuing on with the boats, Boat 6 launched off the port side at 1:10 a.m. So if you can go to the next slide, that is confirmed to be a picture of Boat 6 on the left. And then this one had 29 people on board, including the unsinkable Molly Brown, who's on the right. So she and others successfully tried to convince the quartermaster, who was the officer on board, to go back and rescue people, but he flat out refused. Brown also asked if women could row to keep them warm. And after he refused, she ignored him and started passing out oars. He tried to stop her, but she threatened to throw him overboard. And then she took charge and organized people into shifts for rowing. They eventually tied up with Boat 16, and they were one of the last to reach the Carpathia. And so, with Boat 16, they launched off the port side at about 1:20. We think there were about 40 people on board. Most of them were women and children from second and third class. And then if you go to the next slide, Violet Jessup was on this one. That is the most we are discussing about Violet Jessup.
Our homegirl.
Yeah. And so Boat 14 was launched off the port side at about 1:30 a.m. So if you can go to the next slide, we're going to talk about this one for a little bit. So they had about 58 people on board, because by this point, people on the Titanic were starting to panic, because it was well down into the water at this point and was starting to tilt to the side. And so this boat was led by 5th Officer Harold Godfrey Lowe, who we talked about earlier on. He had been one of the people in charge of, like, loading people onto the port side. At this point, he was the officer in charge of the boat. So he, at gunpoint, refused to let men onto the boat, because remember, he'd been working under Lightoller, who thought the order was women and children only. There was a male passenger hidden under a shawl who made it on board. But other than that, it was like women and children, Lowe, and this dude who was pretending to be a girl. So, Lowe then brought together boats 10, 12, 14, and Collapsible D, and transferred, after those other boats had been launched. Some of those hadn't been launched yet. After they were, he tied all those boats together, transferred all of the passengers out of Boat 14, and then he and boat volunteers took Boat 14 to look for survivors. They ended up rescuing 4 people. 1 died in the boat, but the other 3 survived. And then later on, they rescued people from Collapsible A, which was in danger of sinking, which we'll talk about later. Lowe was an experienced sailor, and he set up the mast and the sail, which you can see in that photo. That boat in the front has the mast up. And so this made Boat 14 the only lifeboat to actually utilize sail power, and it was one of 2 boats that went back to search for survivors. So the next one, Boat 12 launched off the port side at 1:30 a.m. with about 30 people on board. If you can go to the next slide, this is the pulley system. So we should be on slide 35 now, just so everybody knows. One of the crew members in charge had to cut it loose from the mechanism that was lowering it overside, which is what this picture is. Several passengers from other boats were transferred into Boat 12, and it reached Carpathia with at least 69 people aboard.
Jesus.
Yeah, so Boat 9 launched off the starboard side at 1:30 a.m. with about 56 people on board. They also refused to let men on. Boat 11 launched off the starboard side at 1:35 a.m. with about 70 people on board. As it was getting down into the water, it was swamped by a jet of water that was being pumped out of the ship. The passengers were obviously very tense after everything, but one of the passengers had like a music box that was in the shape of a pig, and she used it to entertain the children on the lifeboat. So then Boat 13 was launched off the starboard side. So it was partially filled on the topmost boat deck, and then it stopped at the lower A deck to get more people, which I think this was the first and potentially only boat that did this. So it left the Titanic with 65 people, and the occupants were mainly second and third class women and children. And so it was also swamped by water. And so if you can go to slide 36, their attempt to get away from the jet of water put them directly underneath lifeboat 15, which is being lowered at the time. And so the lowering of Boat 15 was halted like just in time, and Boat 13 had to cut itself free. And then, Boat 15 was launched off the starboard side at 1:41 a.m. with about 65 people. Boat 2 was launched off the port side at about 1:45 a.m. It was launched with about 17 people on board, even though it could hold about 20. So I think this is one of the cutters. The officer in charge, again, wanted to rescue people, but was shouted down. And then boat 10 was launched off the port side at about 1:50 a.m. with about 35 people on board. At this point, the Titanic was listing to port. So this is when that tilt to the left was really becoming a problem. So yeah, it was starting to roll on its side, and it was about 10 minutes from the stern noticeably being lifted into the air. So you're tilted to the left and down pretty badly. And so there was a gap of about 3 feet between the lifeboats and the deck because the lifeboats were hanging from that pulley system. So they basically had to jump into these lifeboats. One woman she missed and she almost fell through the gap, but a steward caught her by the ankle and pulled her back on board.
Oh,
yeah.
God.
And she was able to get into lifeboat safely on her next attempt. And so people had also...
Oh my God.
I know. And so people at this point had obviously realized that the ship was in fact sinking, so they were beginning to panic even more, and people were rushing to get to a boat. But then among the people on boat 10 was the youngest Titanic passenger, 9-week-old Melvina Dean, who was also the last remaining survivor. So if you can go to slide 37, that's her and her mother. She died in 2009.
Wow.
Yeah, she's almost 100. So then boat 4 was launched off the port side.
Ooh.
You okay?
Yep.
I know, that was a lot. That's the worst it's going to get, I promise. So boat 4 was launched concurrently with boat 10. So if you can go to slide 38, I think this is of boat 10, but I'm not 100% sure. It had 42 people on board, and it was the last of the wooden lifeboats to be launched. So it had been ordered to take on more passengers from open gangways, like on its way down, right? But there was nobody there. And so when they got into the water, they immediately started trying to pick up survivors. They actually got 6 or 7, it's debated. We do know 2 of those survivors later, they died of exposure while still in the boat. And so this was one of 2 boats that tried to rescue people at all, and it was the only one to do so immediately upon hitting the water. So collapsible boat C was launched off the starboard side at 2 a.m. I do not have a picture of it. Jesus Christ, that scared me!
Out of nowhere.
That's fine. So, it had about 23 people on board. This boat was on the aft, which is the back. And at this point, the back was starting to raise up into the air. This was the last starboard side boat to successfully launch. There were a couple others that were not successful, but this was the successful one.
that's fine.
Yeah, so there's only 3 more boats. We're almost done. So collapsible boat D was launched off the port side at 2:05. There were about 25 people on board. So if you can go to slide 39, the picture on the left is of collapsible boat D. You can see how it's not like a solid wall,
Yeah,
right?
it's weird in the back.
Yeah, and so like, yeah, I just thought that was a really good visual of like how these boats actually operated. And then those boys on the right are the Titanic orphans. So there were 2 small boys brought through
Let me just be called that for the rest of my life.
There's a story. Hang on, let me tell it. So there were 2 small boys who were brought through the group by a man calling himself Louis Hoffman. He gave the boys to people on the boat. He ended up dying, right? His real name was Michel Navratil. He was a Slovak tailor who had kidnapped his sons from his estranged wife and was taking them to the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the identity of the orphans of the children, who became known as the Titanic orphans, was a mystery, obviously, for some time after the sinking. It was only resolved when their mother recognized them from photographs that had been circulated around the world. And she was French. And I think it took 6 weeks or so for her to get to them. And so those 2 and another boy in that same boat, they were the last children to be rescued. And so then the next boat, collapsible boat D, quote unquote, launched off the port side at around 2:12 a.m. So if you can go to slide 40. So this boat and boat A were the ones that were being stored on top of the officers' quarters. And so they rigged up some ramps so that it could just like slide down onto the deck. But boat D fell through the ramp and it landed upside down. And there wasn't enough time to right it as the Titanic had begun to break up. And so a wireless operator named Harold Bride was actually trapped under the hull. Like, the boat fell on top of him, right? And so right after this happened, the forward funnel snapped and crashed into the water, which pushed Bride and boat B further away from the ship. Bright survived because he could breathe using that air pocket underneath the boat, and he was able to get out from underneath it and onto the exposed hull. And so several others, all men, also got on top of it. It gradually, it was sinking all night because it was upside down, and that air pocket underneath it was just like gradually getting smaller. And they were fully exposed to freezing air and water all night. And so when it was rescued, there were about 30 men on top of that hull. And so the last boat was collapsible boat A. It was washed off the starboard side at 2:12 a.m. And so if you can go to slide 41, this is what it looked like when it was rescued. So you can see it's still like flat. It wasn't actually like uncollapsed, I guess.
Deployed.
Yes, deployed. Thank you. That's a good word. So it was partially submerged and dangerously overloaded by people fleeing the ship. And so, it was never actually launched, but people were able to jump or climb aboard. There were only 13 found alive in the ship, and survivors were later transferred to collapsible boat D. The ship was allowed to drift off with 3 bodies inside and was recovered about a month later. And so this photo is after they had removed the bodies. And so that's all the boats. All told, the Carpathia only rescued 13 of the 20 lifeboats. So the rest were either wrecked, like A and B, or they were empty because a lot of the passengers had been shifted to other boats. And so now I do want to go into the numbers of how many people died in the disaster. Again, these numbers are approximate. So the info I am going to tell you comes from the British Board of Trade report on the disaster, which was published in 1912. So if you can go to slide 42, this is just an infographic because I personally prefer talking about numbers with a visual. This uses different numbers than what I am about to tell you because, again, we don't have numbers, but the percentages are like roughly the same. Okay? So, and then I'm going to break it down children, women, and men because that's how most things divided up. So for children, 5 of the 6 first-class children survived. All 24 of the second-class children survived. And then 27 of 79 third-class children survived, which was 34%. So for the women, 140 of 144 first-class survived. 80 of 93 second-class survived. And then 76 of 165 third-class survived. So it was 46%. And then 20 of 23 female crew members survived. So the women crew members were mostly stewardesses, which may have helped their survival as they were likely on deck helping people into lifeboats or rounding people up, right? So they would have had more access to a lifeboat. So for the men, obviously they lost the most because they were not allowed to get in lifeboats. So 57 of 175 first class survived, so that's 33%. 14 of 168 second class survived, so it was 8%. 75 of 462 third class survived, which that's 16%. And then 192 of 885 crews survived, so that's 22%. And so I looked through the list. So on Wikipedia, there's a table of every known survivor, every known passenger and crew member on the Titanic, and it tells you whether or not they survived, right? And so I looked through it I just wanted to get more data. So of the crew, it appears that most of those who did survive were ranking officers, stewards, or able-bodied seamen. That was their job. And so only 3 restaurant staff survived, for example, but almost all of the ranking officers and a decent amount of stewards survived. So I don't know if that has to do with their physical location on the ship at the time of the sinking, or if it's just that certain people were prioritized. What the fuck is happening? What? Sorry, someone's there might be people here. I don't know what's going on. Sorry. Somebody was just pounding on my door.
Okay.
And so I don't know if that was just a coincidence. I'm assuming it has something to do with their physical location on the ship because, again, the stewards would have been helping people into boats. I don't know.
Well, that and, kitchen staff and stuff like that would have been in their quarters at night.
Yes. So that was part of it as well.
They would have been in, what was it, second or third class area-ish?
Yeah, it was down, in the ship.
Yeah, so I would imagine it's more that than anything else. It's just that their quarters were further away.
Exactly. And so, in total, only about 32%, so 710 of 2,224 of those on board survived, which again, those numbers are fuzzy, but it's usually 32 to 33% is like the known percentage. And then, searchers afterward were only able to recover 340 bodies, and many of those were never identified. So, we're done with all that. Now we're going to talk about the aftermath and things that changed and stuff like that. So if we go to slide 43, these are obviously newspaper articles from like the next day or whatever discussing the sinking. So directly after the incident, a lot of charities were set up to aid victims and their families because many of the survivors had lost their sole wage earner because all the men had died. And if they were a third-class passenger, they'd probably lost everything that they owned because they were probably immigrating. And so, there were a lot of charities set up. On top of this, more than 60 survivors combined to sue the White Star Line in the United States and in Britain. So the claims totaled $16 million roughly, and that's approximately $419 in 2018, which was far greater than what the White Star Line argued it was responsible for as an LLC under American law. And so...
Stupid.
Because the bulk of the litigants, which those are the people suing, right? Because the bulk of them were in the United States, White Star petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court in 1914, which ruled in its favor that it qualified as an LLC and found that the causes of the ship sinking were largely unforeseeable rather than due to negligence. And so what this did was it sharply limited the scope of damages that survivors and their family members were entitled to, which forced them to reduce their claims to about $2.5 million, and White Star settled for about $664,000, which is approximately $16.5 million in 2018, and that's about 27% of the original total that they sought. And then the settlement was agreed to by 44 of the claimants in December of 1915, and then it was broken up for American claimants. They got $500,000. $50,000 went to British claimants, and $114,000 went toward like legal expenses. And so that was basically it with money for them. So the disaster did lead to several new laws and regulations. A lot of them were included in the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, which passed in 1914 and has been updated fairly regularly since then. It increased the required number of lifeboats and required continuous radio surveillance on shift. It was kind of, because it was 1914, so then like World War I happened, so they weren't super worried about this law, but they did eventually like put it in full force. And this was an international agreement. And then in the US specifically, we got the Radio Act of 1912. So this stated that radio communications on passenger ships would be operated 24 hours a day along with a secondary power supply. Also, the Radio Act of 1912 required ships to maintain contact with vessels in their vicinity as well as coastal onshore radio stations. In addition, it was agreed in the International Convention that the firing of red rockets from a ship must be interpreted as a sign of a need for help. And then once the Radio Act...
goodness!
Yeah, once the Radio Act was passed, it was agreed that rockets at sea would be interpreted as distress signals only, thus removing any possible misinterpretation from other ships. So basically, if they shoot off a rocket, they need help. Is basically what that got changed to. And then the other major thing that happened is that this led to the formation and funding of the International Ice Patrol. So if you can go to the slide 44, this is a promotional video from the Ice Patrol. So this is an agency of the Coast Guard. They monitor and report on icebergs. They're still in use today. Except for the years of the World Wars, the Ice Patrol has worked every ice season since 1913. And while they've been in operation, there has not been a single reported loss of life or property due to collision with an iceberg in the patrol area. So it's very, very effective. Yes.
Why have I never heard of them?
I don't know.
Sorry, Hannah, what was your question?
I just like that we're answering each other's sentences. But no, that was not my question. My question is, for the World War years, do you think it was because they needed them for more important jobs, or do you think they were like, well, fuck the German U-boats, they can figure it out for themselves?
I think it was the first one. I think it was the first one.
I like to think that they were like, please hit an iceberg.
I like
please
the
hit an
second
iceberg.
one.
Well, because they still would have wanted to protect their own ships, you know? If it wasn't, you know? Yeah, I think it was that they needed to do other things.
They needed those men to fly, like, bomb planes.
Yeah, it was just, there were other uses for them at the time. So,
Plus, they needed as many planes as they could get.
yeah.
So.
Yeah, so, okay, we're almost done. So,
I like how I just called it a bomb plane.
I mean,
Shelby.
it's fine. So,
Anyway.
with the White Star Line. So, as I've mentioned, there were separate British and American inquiries. They reached, like, basically the same conclusion. The regulations were out of date and inadequate. The captain had failed to take proper heat of ice warnings. The lifeboats had not been properly filled or crewed, and the collision was the direct result of steaming into a dangerous area at too high of speed. So, you may notice negligence was not a factor because they decided negligence by the White Star Line specifically was not a factor in the sinking and the loss of life, which again, I mostly agree with based on the regulations of the time. Like nowadays, it's like clearly they made mistakes, but at the time, that was what they were working with. They didn't have binoculars,
which I'm not saying, obviously they couldn't have used. Yeah. However, when your job is fucking lookout,
I know. You
need a binocular.
I know. And like, the American inquiry labeled it an act of God. Like, yeah. And so, a lot of the survivors were called to testify during these inquiries. And then Lowe, who was that one who was on boat 14, who actually knew how to sail, and who went back and tried to rescue people. So the American hearing was led by the Senate. During that hearing, he was asked what the iceberg was composed of, and he responded, "Ice, I suppose, sir." And then, like, that's the kind of shit they were asking.
That's iconic.
Yeah, like,
I'm sorry.
That's the kind of shit they were asking. And then Lightoller was also called to testify. He stated that, like, the surviving officers considered the American inquiry to be a farce and, like, a waste of time. Because they asked questions like, what is an iceberg made of? And they thought it was
should watch some of our school board meetings.
Yeah, they thought it was, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but the investigation into the sinking of a ship was being conducted by people with no knowledge of sailing or the sea. So they just didn't take it very seriously. Because duh. And then, of course...
that's when we set the precedent of Americans talking about shit they shouldn't have because they have no authority to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
And so the sinking did cause a lack of confidence in large ocean liners, and the Olympic actually had a mutiny shortly after the sinking because they wanted more lifeboats. And so...
yes!
Yeah. And so the White Star Line...
support it.
Yeah, they outfitted the Olympic and the Britannic with more lifeboats and reworked those quote-unquote watertight compartments. Overall, they didn't see any repercussions other than financial ones. Which is kind of disappointing.
Is there a heart on this, Shelby?
Yeah. Why is there a heart?
Yes.
Okay.
Shelby's playing Don't Mind Me.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay, so the last thing we are going
to do that for when we look at the pictures at the bottom of the ocean.
I know, I'm sorry. I just wanted to give examples. You don't have to look at them if you don't want to. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the discovery of the wreckage. So if you can go to slide 45, these are just pictures from the voyage. So
okay, I can look at those.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry.
I can't look at the others.
Okay, that's fine. So in 1985, Dr. Robert Ballard found the wreck of the Titanic. He used an underwater camera attached to a submarine, and that whole thing was called Argo. It scanned the seafloor looking for the wreckage, and they found it about 370 miles southeast off the coast of Newfoundland. And so, obviously it's broken into two pieces, the bow and the stern, which lay about a third of a mile apart from each other, and there's debris scattered around. So if you felt like going to slide 46, the picture on the left is the bow, the picture on the right is the stern.
I just remember seeing that picture of that bow in like maybe third grade and then just being wrecked for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
And so the bow is like still in decent shape. It's like recognizable as the bow comparatively.
I think it was just I couldn't understand why there was so much candle wax on it because that's what it looks like.
I know, that's what the rust looks like.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's what it looks like.
That's all.
Yeah.
Anyway, bye.
And so the stern was completely ruined upon impact with the seafloor. And so there's like several Nat Geo documentaries on the Titanic, and I watched one a few months ago just for fun. And the one I watched was they went back down to look at everything in like 2018, 2019-ish. And they explained better like the crash and everything. So that video basically said that the bow, like it crashed into the floor. God, it crashed into like the ocean.
I mean, it is called the seafloor.
It is called the seafloor. So like it crashed into the seafloor, but it was like coming down like how a boat would normally go because of like the way that it sank at, you know what I mean? So like the bottom hit the bottom like it was supposed to, right? And it just kind of like glided along before it crashed and came to a halt. the stern went in perpendicular. So it was just, and so it just crashed. And so it is not recognizable at all. Unless you knew, like, oh, this is the back of the Titanic. And so both pieces and all of the debris are being completely ravaged by erosion. So if you feel like going to 47, and so in that special, a lot of it too was talking about the erosion.
Okay, I looked at them. That's all I can handle.
Okay, that's fine. And so they compare pictures. I'm just going to explain it for people who can't see these photos. So they compare pictures from 1985 to 2020, and the difference is just striking. And so you can see, if you're looking, the picture in the upper left is the bow, and then the picture underneath it is also the bow. The one in the upper left is from 1985, and the one on the bottom is from 2020. Like, there's a noticeable difference.
The candle wax is gone.
Yeah, the candle wax is gone. And then you can kind of see, so in the upper left corner, I have like those 4 pictures all smushed together. The one at the top is like a bathtub, and then the one on the right by itself is also the bathtub. So that is, I don't remember if it's the captain's bathtub or like, it was somebody important's bathtub. So it used to be on one deck, and it fell down through to another deck. So there's rust.
I hate it.
There's rust. It's the ocean floor. It is just going to eventually dissolve. Right.
I was going to say.
Here's what scares me about what you
metal.
just said. And I know it's like really stupid and irrational, but it's like I know there's things that live in the ocean, but can you imagine just the total complete darkness and then there's just a fucking bathtub falling in the ocean?
I know.
What the fuck?
No, dude, that freaks me out too. Trust me, that freaks me out.
No spoilers, but have you guys seen the second Crimes of Grindelwald movie?
I haven't seen.
Yes.
No, I have not.
You know, Shelby, you know exactly what I'm talking about with what's her face Lestrange's Bogart.
Yeah.
The thing that's just falling in the ocean.
Yes.
I hate everything about it.
Well, we're
It gives
done.
me so mad.
We're done talking about the pieces, so we're done. We can move on. Okay,
Cool.
cool. So cool. Like, cool. We found the Titanic. People can go explore it. People brought shit up, which I personally don't agree with. I think we should have left it there. Whatever. It's fine. So, that's just my own personal opinion.
I understand
Other than for
like
study.
scientific reasons.
Other than for study.
And possibly for like museum reasons.
Yes.
I don't
But-
ever agree with museums stealing shit.
That's
but
fair.
I don't know.
Yes.
Is it stealing if it's at the bottom of the ocean?
That's the question. I
Is
did not
it?
get into
Is
it.
it?
There is a huge legal battle over who owns the Titanic. We are not going to get into that right now. So,
My
Well,
thing,
if it's
real
in,
quick.
if it's in the water, isn't it like maritime law? Doesn't
yes,
the ocean
but I don't
run
know
that bitch?
maritime law, so I cannot answer
Okay,
any
well.
questions.
Should've taken that class, Shannon.
We
Jeez.
don't offer that class because it's in Chicago.
real
Lake.
real quick.
Yes,
My
Shelly.
only thing with museums is I don't agree with them doing like necessarily like archaeological digs and stuff like that unless it is like for the science side of things, and then whatever doesn't get used by the science side goes to a museum because of the like preservation aspect.
What I mean
And
is
like the preservation
Hiram Bingham
and
going to fucking Peru and stealing all the
Yeah.
Inca shit. That's what I'm talking about.
yeah, that I
It's
don't
really
agree with.
stupid
If
and-
it's like preservation and education related, I'm okay to an extent.
And that should
Obviously-
be run by the cultures that it belonged to,
Yes.
if
Yes.
at all possible.
So,
Anyway,
yes. So, okay, we're done talking about the bottom. So, yeah, 1985, cool. We have found the Titanic.
The bum.
Yes. So, yes. We found it 1985. In 2018, it was revealed that Ballard was not, like, totally looking for the Titanic. It was uncovered in 2018 that the expedition was actually part of a, quote, secret U.S. military mission to recover 2 sunken nuclear submarines on the bottom of the ocean. And that's from CNN.
nice.
So, and the rest of this is from CNN. They didn't want the world to know
That's
that.
such an America thing.
I know. They
An
didn't.
America and Russia thing.
They did not want the world to know that, so I had to have a cover story, Ballard said. So Ballard had been a commander in the U.S. Navy. I almost said Army. Nope, wrong one. In the Navy. And a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. The Navy offered him the funding and opportunity to search for the Titanic, but only if he first explored the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, 2 American nuclear subs that sank in the 60s. And so if you can go to 48, which you 2 are already on, I think those are
we
of
had to
those
run
subs.
away.
Yeah, I think those are the correct submarines, but I couldn't tell. They're submarines.
That looks like the albacore, the one I took you to.
Yeah. Yeah. To me,
I mean, they're submarines.
they're submarines.
Say.
Yeah. And so Ballard.
Well, no, I mean, it's shaped like the albacore. I mean, I know
Yeah.
submarines are all similarly
Yeah.
shaped. I mean, this one, like, specifically has the right propeller, is what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. Never mind.
Yeah.
It's fine.
I know what
No,
I mean.
no, you're right.
We're almost done. Okay.
Ah!
So, Ballard continued, we knew where the subs were. What they wanted me to do was go back and not have the Russians follow me, because again, it's 1985, because we were interested in the nuclear
Cold
weapons
War.
that were on the Scorpion and also what the reactors were doing to the environment. And so, when his team finished exploring the Scorpion and the Thresher, they had only 12
Don't
days
pretend
left.
you care about the environment.
They had 12 days left to search for the Titanic, and they found it.
well,
That's
you know.
fucking lucky.
Yeah, and then...
Right.
So, this CNN article that I got all this from came out in December 2018. This information had already been revealed because in May of 2018, the National Geographic Museum had an exhibition called Titanic, The Untold Story. So if you go to the last slide, I wanted to end it on good pictures of the Titanic. And so it featured information about the secret naval operation that the Titanic was like the beard for. And so this exhibit...
The beard.
I mean, am I wrong? So...
No.
And so...
Military beard, you know.
Yes,
Classic.
and so what I'm about to say came straight from the National Geographic, website about this exhibit, which is no longer running. It was developed in collaboration with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and contains loans from the National Archives and Records Administration, the U.S. Navy Submarine Force Museum, 20th Century Fox Archives, and several private lenders. Because, and 20th Century Fox, do you know how much stuff James Cameron, kept and took and did everything for the movie? It was nuts. And so...
Too much.
Yeah. And so the exhibition, which originally exhibited at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum, showcases the history of the discovery from an entirely new angle. Not only are visitors exposed to the historical events that led to the ship's finding, but they can also hear the fascinating stories of some of the passengers on board the ship. Additionally, the exhibit contains a collection of artifacts belonging to survivors that have not been reunited since the night the ship sank in 1912. And that is all that I have. That's all.
Cool.
I would like...
We're under
can I
2.5
throw in a
hours.
quick story?
Yes, please do.
Wait, we're at 2.5 hours?
We're under 2.5
Under.
hours.
Oh, I thought you said we're at... I was like,
No.
Then I'm missing 24 minutes
No,
of...
we're under. I was shooting
panic.
for 2.5,
Okay.
so this is good. This is good. I was shooting for 2.5.
So anyway, my parents have a pool, and every year my dad opens it up around the same
Yes.
time, which is April 1st. And then he throws a shit ton of chemicals in, and you can't swim in it for 2 weeks. And so usually around April 12th is when we jump in the pool, and we always play Titanic because it's really cold water.
Yes.
And if you can get all the way in, you win. And guess who fucking wins every single year?
You.
Me.
Yay.
Me.
Oh, man. Okay, so I'm sorry that was so long. I have a lot of feelings
Don't
about
be.
the
That was-
Titanic, and I wanted to provide
good.
as complete a story as I could because there were so many different factors going into it. And I just got sidetracked while researching and wanted to throw things in. Like the ship prefixes. We didn't need that, but I wanted to bring it up while we were talking about it, But...
I mean, I didn't talk about it with Violet, so, it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and then, when I was researching, the Atlantic sank. Sometimes it was the RMS, and sometimes it was the SS. And I was getting really freaking confused because I thought those were different things, and they're not. So, it was relevant to my research, so I brought it up here. Basically, was what happened.
It's one of those things that, I basically already know, but it's just because, half my family is in the Navy, and... So I don't think about it, but yeah.
Yeah, I knew that
No, you're
RMS
right.
meant Royal Mail Ship or Steamer, but I didn't know that it was the same thing as SS. That just
Yeah.
wasn't... Yeah, and I'm sure other people also don't know that information.
Most
So,
likely.
sorry that was so long.
No, it's good. I turned in my thesis. To
Good. Good, yeah, but again...
I had to pay $108. How
gross.
stupid.
Yeah.
Dumb.
Yeah.
You already paid them.
Tuition.
I'm already in debt to
Yeah.
you sons of bitches.
Yeah, just what I just did. This is what happens when you give a history major free reign to do whatever they want. Because,
And this was the condensed version.
Yeah, this was the
just
condensed
so
version.
everybody knows.
This was me reining myself in. I could have done so much more. And,
She and I hung out earlier today because she is at her mom's house, which is 2 minutes from my house. And she was like, I'm going to go play Sims for the rest of the day so I don't add more to my notes because I can add more to my notes. And I was like, please don't. Me and Hannah
it ended up at
will tap out.
It was like 23 and a half pages. And all of it was notes. Like, my sources are only like half a page. Not even. It was maybe a third of a page. I wanted to be thorough. And then, like, I got into history at, like, a very early age. And so I was really interested in the Titanic, the Salem Witch Trials, and the Holocaust at a very early age. And so I can talk about all three of those things unprompted. So this is me doing research on top of it.
Oh, yeah.
So...
like, my mom used to read us these books about the Irish potato famine when I was little.
Yeah.
Like, very small.
Like...
And so I have been obsessed with that and, like, medieval times. Because did you ever read Crispin and the Cross of Lead? That shit was insane.
Yes.
My mom read me that when I was in 3rd grade. It starts off with him finding, like, a body hanging in a tree.
Great.
And describes how discolored it is.
Fantastic.
It's like, wow, this is great. I love that I'm in 3rd grade.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I started researching Salem and the Holocaust in 4th grade. Like, I distinctly remember, I can't remember jack shit, but I remember that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, I've been obsessed
but, like,
with
1st and 2nd grade, it was either, like, Nancy Drew or, like, Civil War.
Yeah.
Oh
like,
God,
describing battles and blood and gore and, like, ghosts and all the things.
My sisters and I used to play World War II Field Hospital. That was our favorite game.
Yeah. Like, so
my dad used to do, like, models and stuff, and he had one of D-Day that he set up one year at, like, Christmas time, and it was, like, it was a scale model of the entire, like, D-Day scene, and me and my sister played with it, and we were like, we're gonna add our cowboys and Indians to it, and then we're gonna make cannonballs out of the wrapping paper, and that's what happened on D-Day.
Yeah, just,
so,
the moral of this is just, I already knew a decent amount about the Titanic, but I actually learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know, which is always nice for me. And yeah, this is the condensed version. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you like to hear my song so far?
Yes.
I only wrote,
we can end on that. Let's end on that.
Okay. Okay, it's not good and I'm not going to sing it.
That's fine.
This is so stupid. If I die young, buried maiden voyage, lay me down in a sea of ice flow, sink me in the water, pre-dawn, send me away with nearer my God to thee.
Oh my God.
Lord, I was unsinkable.
So
White Star Line, my mother, and then that's where I stopped because I got bored of counting syllables.
I love it.
One of these days.
Someone contact the band Perry.
Yeah.
And
we need to get
Right, I have
licensing
some
rights.
edits.
Oh no, it's a parody. We'll be fine.
yeah.
You can do whatever the fuck you
I
want.
took copyright. We're fine.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten my grade back yet though, so maybe we're not. Okay.
No, we are fine. I know we're fine. My aunt is like the copyright lawyer
that's
at
true.
American University.
That's true. Okay. I'm going to end it here now because we're 2:12. Our ending is that we have no ending. Thank you for sticking with me through this. Again, I'm sorry.
Bye, friends.
Bye.
Nearer my God to thee. Okay, bye. Bye. Thanks for listening to The Triad. Our music is by Scott Buckley. Our audio is recorded by our sound engineers, Craig Bott and Audrey Credo.
If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, YouTube, and Tumblr as The Triad Podcast.
We're also on Patreon as The Triad. Currently, all Patreon funds will go towards the cost of hosting the show. Each tier has its own rewards, but every patron receives our undying gratitude. Do you have comments, questions, or stories? Email us at thetriadpod@gmail.com. And thank you again for listening to The Triad, where we're spooky but sensitive.